In the first days of the North Kingdom, they built a great watchtower on Weathertop. Amon Sûl, they called it. It was burned and broken, and nothing remains of it now but a tumbled ring, like a rough crown on the old hill's head. Yet once it was tall and fair. It is told that Elendil stood there watching for the coming of Gil-galad out of the west, in the days of the last alliance. I'm guest co-host Zachary Heller, and you're listening to the Amon Sûl podcast.
Maya Govanen, welcome to Amon Sûl, a podcast for tall hobbits with elvish aspirations. I'm Father Anthony, an Orthodox Christian priest, and here we talk about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien because we love them and believe in their power to orient us toward what is highest and noblest, or possibly toward the sea. We'll be talking about that today. Today, my guest co-host is Zach Heller, currently serving as Ministries Coordinator at Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Toledo, Ohio. Zach is a native of the Detroit metro area. He graduated from Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in 2023. His background prior to the seminary saw him studying a lot of film, and he is a longtime fan of the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings trilogy, which has brought him both many good friends and a great deal of grief from those friends. Zach, welcome to the Amon Sûl podcast.
Father, thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it, and as much grief as I've received for only watching the movies, it is worth all of it because of how dear those films are to me.
Well, we have strong opinions about those films, good and bad, but I think you're not alone, far from alone, in having been brought into Tolkien's world through those films, and whatever else we can say about them, they definitely accomplished that, and well,
yes.
I mean, frankly, that they got made at all, and that they were made with such fidelity to the source material as they have is really, it's a miracle.
Yes, that's exactly how I would describe it. It's next to Steven Spielberg making Schindler's List and Jurassic Park in the same year, which I still can't fathom. I consider the Lord of the Rings trilogy to be one of the movie miracles.
Well, that's like a logistical miracle, but
Exactly.
but Lord of the Rings is like, how did Hollywood turn this out in the late 90s and early 2000s?
Yes.
That's not what I would have expected.
Okay.
I guess it would be more of a miracle if it happened now, but that's my opinion, and anyway. So on our episode today, Zach and I will be discussing Chapter 4 of the Fellowship of the Ring, the chapter called A Shortcut to Mushrooms, and we'll be discussing what his experience has been this year as he begins his first actual read-through of the greatest book of the 20th century. That's right, folks. We have with us today a first-time reader of The Lord of the Rings in the middle of his read-through, unless you finished before between when we first talked.
I did not. I'm still in the middle. So.
Very good. I think this is going to be great. So, Zach, before we begin and get into all of that, what I really need to ask you is, how did you feel about mushrooms in your food when you were a kid? And would you have ever considered taking a shortcut or a long cut or any kind of cut for the sake of eating anything with mushrooms in it? Because I certainly would not have. And for all of you people who are tittering about mushrooms, this might not be the podcast for you because I'm not even going to dignify that with a response. But Zach, mushrooms and you, go.
So mushrooms and I do not have a storied history at all. It is a food that I find only tolerable in the confines of pasta sauce, believe it or not. So I wouldn't take a shortcut for them, but I would take a long cut to avoid eating them.
There we go. Now, white
Farmer
pasta
Mike
sauce, red pasta sauce, or are we talking, for pity's sake, stroganoff?
Yeah, just marinara sauce is where I find it.
Just
tolerable.
marinara sauce, and it only
Yes.
makes it tolerable.
Yes. There were a few times growing up where I would wake up from a nap to in my opinion, the horrific stench of cooking mushrooms downstairs. So my poor mother, she would make them for the rest of the family, but she knew that wasn't going to have them that night. But so Farmer Maggot doesn't have to worry about me.
There we go. I had a more or less similar relationship. I did learn to appreciate them with the proper spices, maybe in a cast iron skillet, but that took
Yep.
some time. But
Yeah. Now, maybe now that I'm older, I should give it a try. But as of
spices
now,
and
we're still not on the best of terms.
fair enough. Well, there's time. But in the meantime, I will not greet you with or send you a gift basket of thanks of steaming mushrooms. It just no. I'll be kind.
I
So,
appreciate that.
but seriously, before we get into the chapter, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first came to connect with the works of J.R.R. Tolkien? What's your earliest memory of that?
Okay. So, as you mentioned, I have a background in studying film. My undergraduate degree, actually from Ohio State, is film studies.
Mm.
I just because it's relevant to the conversation. I found myself falling in love with the art of filmmaking around the year 2007. I want to say
Mm.
it was the very early days of YouTube, and there is a YouTuber who his name is James Rolfe. He's most famous for his angry video game nerd character, but every October he would do something what's called Monster Madness.
Okay.
It was a 3.5 4 minute video each day of October going through the history of horror films, right? And it was for a fourth or fifth day in, and the
Mm-hmm.
movie that he was talking about was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I want to say the year is 1931. And in that film, to achieve the transformation from Jekyll into Hyde, they used camera filters and just, if I'm not mistaken, physically took the filters off the cameras, and the makeup that they had layered on the actor started to change.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those moments that was just revelatory. Imagine, as it were, the proverbial light bulb going off in my head. So ever since then, I became known as the movie guy at school and amongst friends. So that's a little bit about me. As it relates to the works of Tolkien, so as you mentioned, it's my first time reading, but as unfamiliar as I am with his actual works, I like to say that I'm very familiar with his expansive influence, right?
Okay.
So he's always kind of lurking in the background, as it were, of a fair bit, if not the majority of a lot of the stuff I like to read or watch or video games as well.
Sure.
So if you think of A Song of Ice and Fire, the infamous unfinished series, but that's where my grievances will stop here. Tolkien's influence is obviously all over that.
Sure.
Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere,
Mm-hmm.
the ongoing series. If the writing isn't as literary, or I don't like this word, but it's the best one I've got right now, flowery, as Tolkien's, the world building absolutely is.
Sure.
So, and as I'm reading this, and Frodo, son of Drogo, I'm like, that's Khal Drogo from
Oh, okay.
Ice and Fire. So little things like that. I had read The Hobbit in high school,
Okay.
which I was very fond of. It was either was the best situation to read in because my teacher, we just give us class time to lay down and read and whatever, and it was just wonderful. And then we would have discussions about it. So the depth of Tolkien's work really became apparent to me there.
Mm-hmm.
So there was that, and then of course, growing up with the films, my first memory, it's got to be 2002.
Yeah.
I would come down to Columbus, Ohio, to visit my cousins every summer, and my grandparents, and my cousin. And this is right when Two Towers was coming out, or had already come out on home video, and my cousin showed me the Battle of Helm's Deep.
Yeah.
And little 7-year-old Zachary was just over the moon with the action, with the just the threats, the production design was out of this world. It was really incredible stuff. So, and then that continued afterwards. My cousin kept showing me, we went back and watched Fellowship, and then when Return came out, we watched that as well. And so it became, like the generation that experienced Star Wars starting in 1977.
Yeah.
I had a very similar experience with the Lord of the Rings movies, and I've revisited them probably once a year since then, extended editions, on top of extended discussions with all of my friends. Played the video games with my friends growing up. So, and what was cool about the video games actually is that gave me little glimpses into Tolkien's world,
Right.
right? Because the movies have little bits of dialogue here and there that kind of hint at the depth of the first age, the second age, and whatnot. But the video games would have things mentioning the Valar or the Valinor, and little me go, well, what's that? That sounds really interesting. That
Sure.
wasn't I missed that in the movies while I was too busy paying attention to the action.
Right.
So that really, stoked my interest and has kept it alive for years. And if I could, do I have time to briefly talk about the movies
Sure,
and
by all means.
just
Well, I think we'll come back to them in
sure,
some specifics, but by all means, talk about
yeah,
because the movies are, I think, where you really were hit over the head with it.
yes, I would. One of the things I love talking about when it comes to the Lord of the Rings movies is that Peter Jackson, before he made those movies, was famous for his horror films.
Yeah.
It's something that I found very shocking when I first took a dive into his work. And he's very famous for a film called Brain Dead or Dead Alive, which
Okay.
is infamous for being. I'm just remembering now, actually, from the Monster Madness series. Movie theaters supplied barf bags for that film
Oh wow.
because of the level of gore that he put into the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so it might be sitting on my shelf right now, but I remember watching that in high school and noticing that the humor and the camera angles that he would later use in the Lord of the Rings films were present already. And it
Sure.
was just very surprising to see that connection there. And then because horror is very rarely associated with deep emotional affection beyond scaring you, right?
Sure.
But then you go and watch, at least for me, you watch Lord of the Rings, and all it takes is me hearing the song that Howard Shore composed for the Shire and
Mm-hmm.
seeing the New Zealand landscapes for me to get teary-eyed.
Right.
Which, if you watch Dead Alive, it's very surprising. It almost doesn't compute, but
Well,
um,
I remember when Peter Jackson first announced that he was going to make the films, and I was
mhm,
following along avidly on
mhm.
a fan site that I don't think exists any longer, but
Mhm.
Harry Knowles' Ain't It Cool News was
Oh, yes.
um,
Mhm.
a big deal to me, really, because it was where I was getting anything about the production. But I'd never heard of Peter Jackson before, and yeah, when I
Mhm.
looked him up, I'm like, I've never seen any of these movies because I was a
Mhm.
very sheltered, homeschooled,
Mhm.
evangelical Protestant,
Mhm.
and yeah, horror was non-existent as a genre to me, and frankly still is.
Mhm.
But I remember being really deeply concerned, like, this is the guy they're having make Lord of the Rings. This is going to be
Right,
catastrophic. And I
right.
guess it's part of why I would say it's miraculous that it got made in the way that it got made.
Yeah,
Not least because I don't think anybody would have predicted Peter Jackson would be the one to do something with such fidelity.
certainly.
But his skills, again, as the film amateur, I can see how the skills he honed in
Mhm.
that particular genre, I think I recognize them in the Lord of the Rings films, but
Yes.
yeah.
What I noticed I'd gone back and watched a few videos on them, uh, almost in preparation for this,
Hmm.
and what one of them mentioned was that even as he cut out parts of the material, extended this, shortened that, whatever, he still was taking bits and pieces of dialogue or quotes from characters and keeping it in the films um, to keep that sense of Tolkien, I don't like this word, but the vibe of Tolkien, as it were.
Sure.
So I think that helped him maintain on the feeling that I'm getting reading the books for the first time. That what's very striking about those movies now, even though we're not even 25 years out from Fellowship, what's striking about those movies is there's almost a complete lack of cynicism within them.
Hmm.
there's not necessarily a denial of evil in the world, but an acknowledgement that good will triumph.
Mm-hmm.
And as a frequent film goer, still, less so now that I work, but still more than probably the average person.
It does put a damper on the relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah, a little bit, right? But in a lot of films these days, I don't get that sense of hope or optimism or um, maybe belief in old time traditions and the things that came before us. Well, in my opinion, one of the unfortunate aspects of current mainstream filmmaking or the
Sure.
Hollywood system, whatever it is there seems to be a fixation on a deconstruction of various tropes and themes and characters that define Tolkien and the things that inspired Tolkien and maybe what he inspired.
Mm-hmm.
And deconstruction's fine. I don't have a problem with it. Every once in a while, yeah, let's take it apart and see what it's made of.
Sure.
But if you're going to deconstruct, not put it back together, you're needing a compelling replacement. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find those in a lot of modern films that I've seen, and it's sad. But what that does mean, though, is when I go back and watch Lord of the Rings, it's still fresh. It still feels new because it's a cliche phrase, but they don't make them like that anymore, right?
Right. Right.
So
And it's funny because a lot of the criticisms that I can make of the films myself, from the non-film buff, non-film
sure,
students,
yeah.
fan of the books and so forth, in a certain sense, they touch on a lot of the same things that you see as positives, and I see them as well. But then I would criticize how they're done.
Okay,
In the and I don't want to. We could talk about the films for a long time, and
sure,
that's part
yeah,
of
yeah.
why I brought you. But I don't. We
Appreciate
have
that.
other stuff to do.
I'm
But
certainly
but
bothered.
like the Shire. I love the Shire, as depicted by Peter Jackson, and also I feel like while he's God bless him, he's trying to depict something that is wholesome and real and lasting and solid, but it almost feels like he's trying to depict it as one who doesn't understand it. It's a little bit
Hmm,
superficial. It's a little,
interesting.
uh,
Okay,
it's not quite cloying, but it starts to get towards that a little bit.
okay,
But that's my impression. But
okay.
nonetheless, he's trying to do it, and he's trying to do something that I think even by his time had more or less been set aside as not really the thing, as
Mhm,
naive or
mhm.
childish, or all the things that George R. Martin says publicly about Tolkien's writings.
Yes,
Anyway,
I can see what you mean. That the grimdark was most certainly in
sure,
at the time when these were in pre-production and production. So
right. The other thing that I have to say, just because I haven't had a chance to say this here, is I think,
mhm.
again, Howard Shore is magnificent, but the one big problem with his Shire theme is that for the first couple bars, it rips off an old. I guess it's a hymn. The words of which were "This is my Father's world," and
Mm.
so this is my Father's world. These are my listening ears. Dum 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 da da dum. Anyway,
Oh wow.
but you wouldn't know that because you
No,
grew
I
up
wouldn't.
in the Orthodox Church, and so you
Yeah.
had no reason to be spoiled by that. But yeah, that was the first thing that I thought, and it actually took a while for. Yeah,
Mhm,
I don't really think of it anymore. I'm
mhm.
much further from my Protestant roots than I was then.
Okay.
Anyway,
Well, yeah.
to avoid then going on and on about film
Sure.
and
Sure.
those films, because we'll talk about it a little bit later, I think
Of course.
let's move on. Final question to get a
Yes.
sense of how you personally interact with Tolkien's works. If you had to pick one, which character in Tolkien's works are you most like? Which character would you most like to be like? Or which location in Tolkien's legendarium would you like to live in or visit? We give you options. So, what do you think?
It's at the risk of sounding like a poser, as it were, I would most like to be like Gandalf. And
Oh, go ahead.
yes, the reason I would most like to be like Gandalf is what has come through the reading so far is that even though Gandalf understands that the world has evil in it, I touched on it a bit earlier. Even though he understands that that is to be the case, he does not. He has an unwavering faith in the triumph of good,
Mm.
and in a world that continually does not talk about Christ as much as I believe it should, I would love to have that unwavering faith in the triumph of Christ,
Mm.
in the hope of the resurrection, and glory to God. That is something that this Lenten season has afforded me the opportunity to do. So, but Gandalf's wisdom just has always brought me comfort, and I connect with that character quite a bit. So, if I could be like one of those characters, I most certainly would pick Gandalf.
That's really beautiful. I don't actually know if Gandalf is a frequent answer when we ask these questions, and it's
Hmm.
funny because I think a lot of people think, oh, he's too, he's not attainable. To be an incarnate angel is not
Hmm.
really
Yeah.
an option. But as you say it, really in the last few episodes, we've been kind of talking about this, and I've realized, Gandalf is kind of my model of a certain aspect, at least, of pastoral care.
Hmm. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Because Gandalf will, uh, Gandalf doesn't give advice. He does
Hmm.
not push or force anyone else's will.
Right.
And I hadn't realized it when I was first ordained or necessarily for a number of years, but that fundamental lesson is deep in me as well, that whatever leadership is, whatever pastoral care is, whatever the priesthood is, it must not be the domination of other wills. It must not be
Mm.
coercive. There's an element, but I think it connects to what you're saying. That
Hmm.
absolute trust in the ultimate triumph of the one who created all things. That
Yes.
absolute trust, and he's the one in the whole books who really makes reference to that reality.
Hmm.
Because when he says to Bilbo, I can say it no plainer than that Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by
Yes.
its maker. That is the most explicit I think we get in the Lord of the Rings of a creator, a one who moves in the matters of the world. That is,
Hmm.
neither Maya nor Vala, and certainly not a rebel like Sauron, but
Hmm.
is that this is the working of Iluvatar, the creator himself.
Right.
Anyway, so yeah,
Yeah.
I like that
I,
answer. That's a great
yeah.
answer.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because the adaptation of that quote is my favorite scene from the film.
Hmm.
Specifically when he says, you know, uh, Bilbo was meant to find the ring,
Hmm.
which means you were also meant to have it, and that is an encouraging thought.
Right.
And uh, I'm not a crying man much more in my life, but play that scene for me, and I'm done. I'm useless after
Yeah.
that. So
In the
it's just
movies, they put that in
wonderful.
Moria, right?
Correct.
At the
It is.
crossroads.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So.
Yeah. Very good. I got a kick on this read through. Now we're going back a couple of chapters, but
Mhm.
I hadn't really remembered what Frodo's response is, because in the books, Gandalf he doesn't say that is an encouraging thought. He says that may be an encouraging thought, and
Yeah.
Frodo doesn't get it. He's like, it is not at all. But it's there for
Yeah.
anyone who pays attention.
Absolutely.
So,
So.
and then finally, before we
Mhm.
actually launch into reading the chapter we're here to read,
Yes.
I'd love to hear what your thoughts are so far on the books. Having heard about what you think about the movies, but
Mhm.
what's your take? What's your review so far?
Um, it's very rare that things surpass expectations, and I believe this is one of those times.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, I've heard my entire life, it's like Tolkien. It's like Tolkien. It's like Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, and I was far too young when I tried to read the books for the first time. It just didn't work in my head. And so it's been built up over the years, right? And to have it not only meet but exceed expectations is just pure joy. I I've had so many things that have been built up, and then I either watch it or read it. I'm like, oh, well, that was a piece of media, but I'm your your description of greatest book of the 20th century. As I was doing some perfunctory non-academic internet research into the books before I started, that phrase kept coming up again and again and again. Greatest literary work, greatest book of, et cetera, et cetera. And within 20 pages, I'm like, I can see how they arrived at this conclusion. What was impressive is how fast it grabs you. You feel like you've sat down in front of a hearth with a family member that you love listening to, and they're telling the best story that they know.
Yeah.
And so that's been one aspect of it. Another has been, consciously and subconsciously, whatever, the movies are running in my head as I'm reading the books. And what's funny about that is they're so different in a lot of crucial places that the movie stops, but the images of the characters keep going. So even though Frodo in the books is 60-ish years old when he begins his quest, I'm still seeing a baby-faced Elijah Wood, scampering through the Shire with Pippin and Sam. So, and that's another thing, which is what's so striking is just how rich this world is. It was, not too long ago where I found out that Tolkien's main idea with these books was the philology, was the language. And of course, I'm no philologist myself. As it relates to learning Greek from seminary, I would tell the professors, we'll learn it before I die. So I'm giving myself a long enough time. Right?
That's not a bad strategy.
Right. But, in an interview, he said, I wanted to find out where these languages came from. And lo and behold, they come out of one of, if not the most fully realized and impressionable fantasy worlds I've probably ever seen.
Yeah.
There's just a warmth that's present in the prose it's not foreign to me, but it's, again, I can't find it in modern film. I have a hard time finding it in modern literature, right? It's a lack of cynicism, an embrace of fun and adventure without any, underlying agenda. Maybe that's me still being new to the books, but and a real respect for the characters and specifically their friendships.
Yes.
The friendships are so well defined. They remind me of the friendships that I have in my life in the best way possible, in their best moments.
Yes.
So when I'm, in Tom Bombadil's where they're all taking baths together, a modern author would handle that very differently. But in this, you're right. In this, it's just, this is the beauty of friendship. They have been on the beginning of this quest together. They're taking a break together. It's the camaraderie is there, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm realizing this now. As an American, I'm very familiar with rugged individualism, right?
Sure.
It's nice to see a contrast to that.
Right.
So, but so far it's just been a joy. I had set them aside a little bit for Lent, but after our conversation, I think I'm going to dive back in and keep going, because it's just been wonderful to go back to the writing, to see how good Tolkien was at writing. There's a whimsy there. It's fun. I guess this is the highest compliment I can pay it, is it reminds me why I love books so much.
Beautiful.
As much as I love movies, if you had, the stories that my parents love to tell is they find me in the morning at 5 years old, and all my books would be in bed with me because I just late reading them. And so these are why books should be read, is Lord of the Rings. So
I think that's exactly Tolkien's intent. But no, you gave a beautiful answer and one worthy of the journey that you were on. Because I'll tell you, I think for any of us that read Lord of the Rings as children, the one
Mhm.
regret that we have, balancing the privilege of having had the story, these characters, as companions for all our lives, is that we can never read it for the first time again.
Yeah.
And that when we read it for the first time, there was so much that we missed. And I
Mhm.
think that's built in. It rewards rereading in a way that few other stories I've found ever.
Very
Well,
much so.
frankly, what other stories reward rereading? To that degree. Again, it's very few, which I think is why
Yes.
it's legitimate to say greatest book of the 20th century and one of the great books of human history.
Yes. I mean, it's hard. I struggle hard to think of many books that are
Yeah.
referenced more than these,
Yeah. And
outside of
you,
some other obvious answers. So,
right. And you said, you've been told all your life, this is like Tolkien, that's like Tolkien, but in my experience, nothing is actually like Tolkien.
yes, and I'm very glad you said that because you're right.
Yeah.
It's as much as people wanted to call, it was the pull quote for all the Game of Thrones books as they were
Hmm.
getting re-released for the series, which,
Sure.
you know, Martin is the American Tolkien, and
Well,
uh,
Robert Jordan was the American Tolkien before
or,
George R. Martin, and I remember the
yeah,
quote because I saw it so many times. Jordan has begun to expand on the world
the
Tolkien
world.
began to reveal, or something like.
Yeah,
No, no, he hasn't.
yeah,
Jordan's fun for a lark, but you don't really come back to him.
yeah.
Not.
I don't have much experience with the Wheel of Time, unfortunately, but um, it, upon reading these the first time, I realized George R. R. Martin is very good at one thing. Finishing series is not one of them. But
Mhm.
he's he will always be in Tolkien's shadow, and
Yeah.
so will anybody that and anyone that writes fantasy now, post the release of the books for the first time, owes
Mhm.
something to these books. They
Yeah.
can't get away from it, no matter how much they try. And at the risk of sounding pretentious, so I apologize, they probably won't better him.
I don't see how anyone could. This was his life's
Exactly.
work.
Exactly.
His entire being, his entire
Mhm.
all of his faith, all of his love, in some sense,
That's a really nice way of
is
putting it.
all of his trauma, all of his grief and suffering and loss. All of
Sure.
it is poured into these books from beginning to end, and
Mm, that's very okay. I
and
appreciate that. Yeah.
I don't know how much you want or plan to get into this, but the remarkable thing about Tolkien as a writer is that I think this has to be absolutely unique. We have access to his entire creative process in a way that we simply
Mhm.
don't for. If anyone else has that, I'd be shocked. Because his son Christopher spent his entire life
Mhm.
uh, studying, examining, collating, collecting, editing, and publishing every version, as it seems, that Tolkien wrote of all of these different things, and that's precious. It's remarkable.
Very much so. I was taken by how many History of Middle Earth books there were, as I started to look into the different parts of the lore that were accessible to me, and
Hmm.
it's truly incredible.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway, we said this would be a brief discussion in the script, but I think we're a half an hour in. That's not too bad. Let's go ahead and move on. Our next segment is when we get to some of our listener questions and comments. So we're going to read two emails today, both because I think they're relevant to this chapter, and I think, and because I think, Zach, you are probably going to have something strong to say about both of these. So our first is from listener Josh from June of last year of 2024. It's still addressed to Father Andrew and to Richard, as he was only on episode 78 of the podcast when he wrote, so he hadn't heard the announcement about the podcast's end and then transfer to me that came in episode 100. So I'm going to read this email, Zach, so that you can respond right away to what Josh has to say. So he wrote, after some introduction, he says, "It seems from a lot of listener comments and even a good amount of guest comments that people view Sam in higher regard than Frodo. I always heard this from people, that Sam is the real hero. I can kind of understand that impression from the movies because movie Frodo seems sad and pouty throughout. My experience with the books, though, gave me another impression. The book Sam seemed to me as a terrible companion on a journey. He's always complaining and disapproving of everything that happens. He redeems himself with the Shelob encounter and after, but before he was kind of insufferable to me. On the other hand, I've come to realize that Frodo's relative silence throughout shows his incredible resilience. To me, it seems like being the ring-bearer brought incredible suffering, first, because of the temptations of the ring itself, and second, because of the incredible weight that his task is on top of the temptations. I got the impression that he was enduring without complaint the whole time, and while Sam was complaining the whole time without even having the ring to carry, Frodo was practicing incredible asceticism. The positive thing about Sam's companionship was just that while Frodo wanted to isolate and suffer in silence, Sam forced him to have a buddy, which is important when you're dealing with a heavy burden. As Denzel Washington's character says in American Gangster, "The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room." I'm sure I misread that. It seems to me people really overlook the amount of suffering Frodo was going through. Not just of the grueling journey that Sam was experiencing as well, but add on to that the strongest temptation the devil himself can conjure. It's hard enough fighting through an addiction, but imagine the suffering you would go through if you were an alcoholic and had to go on a 6-month brewery tour and then had to smash the free beer they offered at the end. Frodo needs more love and respect.
I want to give Josh as many props as I can for connecting one of the 2 or 3 Ridley Scott movies I actually like to Lord of the Rings. American Gangster is a great film. So, and I just want to go back to the top. And yes, I understand where that impression comes from, that Sam is the real hero, that would come from the movie watchers, because talk about a first read through, that's one of the first things I notice is that Sam is not like he is in the movies. And Frodo in the movies, it's almost a running joke amongst film fans or I imagine book fans as well, that Frodo seems to end up in a lot of bad situations with a bad attitude. Of course, he is the one that gets stabbed by the Nazgul on Weathertop. He's the one that gets attacked by Shelob. He's the one that, again and again, and Elijah Wood's face does not do the character any favors. Unfortunately, I'm a big fan of Elijah Wood, but it has spawned memes, and I'm sure he knows that. So, but
I remember I ruined the movies for a mutual, very dear friend of ours. It wasn't me actually; it was my presbytera, who just said, I can't stand him. He looks like he's constipated the whole time.
She's not wrong. That's fair. But
I interrupted you. You were
no, that's okay. I appreciate that Josh said that Frodo is suffering in silence to a certain extent. Yeah. And if we go back to the conversation in the movies and the books as well, I realized that Frodo's the only one that can do this.
Mm-hmm.
Gandalf picks him on purpose because he knows that Frodo's the only one that can handle this burden. And the support that's given to him afterwards is, again, testament to Tolkien's theme of friendship and the bonds that builds. But, I understand that in the book, Sam's complaining probably goes a bit far. So,
I think I would disagree with Josh about Sam. he's a little rough, I guess, as you're going through the Amon Sûl, and well, you don't know these words necessarily. Well, you do
Not
from the
yet.
movies, right?
Someday.
As you're going through the Amon Sûl and then the Dead Marshes and coming in,
Mhm.
basically, he doesn't like Gollum, and that I think is the harshest thing we can really say about Sam. He's solid as a rock basically through the whole books, but his response to Gollum shows him really at his weakest. And in that place, I think I can agree with
Yeah.
with Josh. It's not. That's his temptation, though. Really.
Yeah.
But
And help me, and correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like they preserved that antagonism in the films very well
yes.
between Sam and Gollum. Now, I think to be fair, everybody would have a terrible road trip with Gollum.
Yes. No one's pick.
No, yes, exactly. But how oddly relatable. Unfortunately, I'm sure everyone has one person that they just can't bear to be with sometimes, and for Sam, it just happens to be poor Smeagol.
Poor Smeagol. But I really do like, at least in this email, I think it's Josh, I think, is recognizing a really important relationship, and that Frodo and Sam do represent two distinct poles of how to face adversity.
Yes,
They're not facing the same adversity, but
right.
yeah, I don't have to I don't have to agree with all of his conclusions,
Hmm.
but I like he's recognizing something that's important. So
Hmm.
very good.
His, if I apologize, can I
No,
go back just real
absolutely.
quick? Oh, his comment at the bottom. It's hard enough fighting through an addiction, but imagine the suffering you would go through if you were an alcoholic, had to go on a 6-month brewery tour, and then had to smash the free beer they offered at the end. Besides being wonderfully humorous, it does raise a good point. If I'm reading this properly, and Frodo is representing someone suffering from an addiction,
Yeah,
those that suffer, or excuse me, those that support those suffering through an addiction
mm,
go through their own type of adversity, as you just mentioned. Uh,
absolutely.
I'm sure some listeners can relate to that. So I thank you, Josh, for helping me understand a little better.
Well, actually, now you say that does actually put a whole new cast on why Sam would have such a hard time with Gollum, because
Exactly.
Gollum is the ever present reminder of
Hmm.
what path Frodo is on,
Ooh,
and
that's a great point.
and you have to be dealing with that even as you're trying to support and love and care for
Hmm.
the person who's dealing with the thing, and you can't carry their burden for them, and
Yep.
anyway, yeah. So there's a
It's,
lot there.
and
Uh,
just to add to that, the beginning section of Return of the King, the film, Andy Serkis based his performance on heroin addicts,
hmm
and it's very evident. So,
Yeah.
anyways,
Anyway, thank you, Josh. That was a fruitful and helpful email, and I hope you're still around with us to participate in the conversation. If you have more thoughts, please send them through. We'd love a follow up. So, for our second listener email, we received this from listener Carson back in November of this past year, just after the first episode that I did, the Many Partings episode with Father Andrew and Richard. But I think Carson as well was still very much in our back catalog at the time, so he's still writing to my illustrious predecessors. So he writes the following. Zach, would you read this one?
absolutely. Greetings, Father Andrew. First, in relation to the Amon Sûl podcast, I am a new listener, but I have been very much enjoying the podcast. As I near the end of my time in seminary, I am looking forward to having space to read Lord of the Rings and explore the Tolkien universe. My brother and I were discussing various fantasy video games, movies, and novels, and eventually we got on the subject of Tolkien. To my surprise, my brother was a little bit critical of Tolkien and said that his work, that he generally liked, was seemingly losing its appeal to modern audiences. My brother is part of Gen Z, and typically he pays attention to pop culture. He went on to explain this is because Tolkien's work is slower, and he seemed to also indicate that this might be because of the underlying hopeful worldview presented in Tolkien's works. It does not take a genius to search films on Netflix to see many of the worlds being built in our time are quite dark. The same could be said of new novels that focus on political backstabbing, sexual adventures, and the power of evil. I could go on, but I think you will understand my point. It seems the shifting culture is producing worlds which do not have, as Tolkien's world has, a hopeful and even Christian worldview underscoring the narrative. I know on some level humans cannot escape the various themes God has placed in our hearts, but to the degree we reject those or even counter them, are some of the new worlds being made actually anti Christian? My conversations with my brother ended with a discussion about a couple other book series that, while I have not read them, sounded like they were much more based in political power and dark magic than hope. I would love to hear your thoughts on this shift and the importance of Christians, even if they are not writing allegorically, to create stories which bring life and hope rather than darkness.
So I have my own thoughts about this whole situation. I
Hmm.
certainly know I have a hard time walking through bookstores anymore. I used to love, going to
Hmm.
Borders or Barnes and Noble or just whatever local used bookstore. But so much of the stuff that's on the shelves just does nothing to draw my attention or my interest. Or if
Hmm.
it is, it's like, what in the world is that doing on the shelves in public? Can I even bring my kids here anymore?
Right.
Which was not generally my experience. Oh, God help me, 30 years ago, in the mid '90s.
Hmm.
And certainly, if I look at the various media properties coming out, it's hard to find anything worthwhile in movies or books or video games, at least the ones that are popular. But
Hmm.
but then again, there are always surprises, and I'm conscious I'm getting a fair bit older than I used to be, and this might partially just be a symptom of get off my lawn syndrome, which I've already been inclined towards from my early youth. I was born
Hmm.
old. I know before I turn it over to you, Zach, I think Father Andrew and Richard probably would be chuckling at this because their new venture, the Great Tales, really is spending a whole lot of time every 2 weeks. They're reading classic literature, classic stories, myths, and
Hmm.
legends, really digging deeply into, even pagan stories, even non-Christian, but not anti-Christian. And there's something to that. That also Tolkien and Lewis and the other Inklings recognized. I remember something Lewis is reported to have said. That to get people to take Christianity seriously, we almost need them to become pagans again first, so that they can appreciate the liberation, the freedom from. And now I'm kind of adding my own thing in. They can appreciate the liberation from those, from the old gods, as it were, that comes with the gospel. But but yeah, looking at what's going on in. You'd already touched on this in your
Hmm.
commentary about, Martin and films and how hard it is to find something that is uplifting
Right.
uh, or anyway. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, of course, I'm very inclined to agree with Carson. And I wonder about, he says, to my surprise, my brother was a little bit critical of Tolkien, said that the work was seemingly losing its appeal. And what I find interesting is I wonder if Tolkien's work is going to start regaining its appeal.
Mm,
I believe that in the last 5 years, post COVID and all of the effects and experiences that we went through, not only led people to a certain conclusion about um, the lives of consumerism that we live and whatever, but a almost a desire for that good again.
hmm.
That the lack of cynicism that's present in Tolkien's works. So I wouldn't be shocked, like I just said, to see a coming back to the love of Tolkien like that, or realizing that that foundation can't be shaken. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's always been there. It just got covered up a little bit.
Right.
Um, let's see. I want to just going back to read parts of it. You mentioned walking through the bookstores and seeing what's on the shelves currently, and I still do that very frequently, just because. Barnes and Noble is like comfort food for me.
Sure.
But there are, I've mentioned this quite a few times in conversations with friends. I find it very concerning, and we might be laughed at in certain circles, but I don't care, that tarot cards are so
Mhm.
prominently displayed and encouraged and almost made to look cutesy or Disney-y,
Mhm.
if you will. And that bothers me quite a bit. And
Mhm.
there's a book that my friend and I, we would send pictures of it to each other when we'd find in various bookstores, called "Queering Your Witchcraft." And I just exactly, it's I don't
Mm.
I don't understand it. I never will. And but those are times you do your cross and realize, well, the greatest book of the 20th century is still available to you, and it's something to turn back to. But yeah, the culture is shifting. I don't know which way it's going to end up going,
Mm.
but I just, based on conversations I've had with people at our parish and people that have come through our parish, and I believe the world is turning back towards an embrace of the attitudes of Tolkien's works, even
Sure.
if they're not necessarily found in Tolkien's works, if they're finding them in other places. That hunger
Mm.
for an embrace of good over evil. The joke I always make is, I know the world sucks. Now tell me why it's good.
There we
Tell me,
go.
tell me how we can make it better, right? So,
Yeah. The only thing that really troubles me in this email is, the criticism of Tolkien because
mhm.
he's losing his appeal. It's like, I would be more concerned if people who wanted and are drawn to all of the things that are evidently, increasing their market share, judging from the bookstores. I would be more concerned if those people had a hunger and a desire and an openness to Tolkien, as it were.
Okay.
It seems good to me that the distinction, that it's not difficult to disambiguate Tolkien's works
Mhm.
from whatever the fantasy, erotic, whatever, of du jour
Yeah.
is presently.
Yes.
Um,
It's you. Yeah, you raise a really good point with that. I'm not surprised that the big fantasy series over the last few years have been the ones that you just mentioned.
yeah,
With that
vampires
that's
and other paranormal stuff, bleeding over into romance or something like that.
very much.
It's okay. This is not just
Yeah.
implicitly, but becoming explicitly demonic.
Yeah. Oh, very much
Um,
so.
but
And
yeah,
your Lewis quote really struck me. And the Carson's email ends, and he says that the importance of Christians.
yeah.
There was an article written not too long ago by a gal named Louise Perry, and I
Hmm.
won't go into it, but what struck me was the title of the article, which is "We Are Repaganizing."
Yeah. I'm a
So,
little bit familiar with Louise Perry because I think she was a
mhm.
guest or featured on the surprising rebirth of faith in God. I'm butchering the podcast title,
Yes,
but
I believe she
Justin Brierly's podcast of
yes,
last year, and
great
I think
podcast
he just
series.
started the new season a couple weeks ago, last week. I just saw it on
Mm,
my feed today.
okay,
At any rate, yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with her. Uh,
yeah.
the other thing I want to say, because I kind of have to, is are you familiar with Kipling's poem, The Gods of the Copybook Headings?
Unfortunately, no.
So I'm not going to quote it here because I have a bad reputation for quoting Kipling at inappropriate times. And basically, to the people who criticize me, all times are inappropriate times. But the premise of the poem is that humanity has been chasing after the gods of the marketplace, whatever is appealing, whatever is
Mhm.
attractive, for as long as we've been around. But the gods of the copybook headings are, the copybook headings is a reference to, in an old, 18th century, 19th century copybook, there would be little proverbs, so
Mm,
the wages of sin is death,
mhm.
or this sort of thing, that the kids would copy out. So the gods of the copybook headings are reality as it cannot be messed with, and the
Mm.
gods of the marketplace, they promise all these wonderful things, but well, But presently word would come that a tribe had been wiped off its ice field, or the lights had gone out in Rome, is a quote. So,
Okay.
so whatever. The marketplace is running after madness. And madness will be madness is what is sown, madness is what will be reaped. But
And in greater quantities.
right. But truth
Unfortunately.
and beauty will still be there to
Yes,
to pick up the pieces. So
of course. Of course.
anyway, that's probably all we've got time for today.
Okay.
But feel free, in terms of questions and comments, feel free to send more to us at Amon Sûl at ancientfaith.com, or you can message us via the Facebook page, and you may hear it on an episode to come. So, this brings us to the main portion of our episode today. Besides sharing his experience as a first-time reader and his expertise on Gen Z and movie matters, I've asked Zach to come on the podcast today to talk about the 4th chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring, A Shortcut to Mushrooms. If you, dear listener, have not read this recently, I will urge you to pause and reread the chapter before you continue. But if you prefer not to, we will sum up the basic shape of the chapter before we begin. We remember that we last left Frodo after his conversation with Gildor the elf, following a beautiful meal with the elves at Woodhall in the middle of the night. So, the outline. There are 4 parts to this chapter. Part 1 is waking at Woodhall, and while eating food left by the elves, Frodo thinks over Gildor's advice to bring his friends with him when he leaves the Shire. He dismisses it as impossible and considers even leaving Sam behind. Then he talks with Sam, and he finds that the elves have warned Sam against leaving Frodo, and Sam is doubly determined to stay with him, even if it means he never returns to the Shire. Frodo is grateful, and he seems to give up the idea of leaving Sam behind. So, part 2, cutting across country. Frodo announces they will leave the road behind. Pippin argues he'd counted on the beer at the Golden Perch Inn, but Frodo insists, worried about being caught on the road. They go down the slope, they find a stream blocking their path, think about returning up the slope, but see a black rider there where they had breakfasted, so off they go to find a place to cross the stream and continue across country. At lunchtime, they stop to rest, but they hear 2 Nazgul screams, one seemingly from behind, one from ahead, so off they go again. Part 3, Farmer Maggots. They reach more settled land, and Pippin recognizes Farmer Maggot's fields. Frodo is terrified, as he had used to raid the fields for mushrooms, and the farmer had threatened him and had his dogs chase him off. Frodo has been scared for decades. They reach Farmer Maggot's. He's welcoming to them, but has news to share of a stranger he'd only just chased away. He invites them to join him for a meal, and he tells them of a Nazgul, a black rider, that had come looking for Baggins. He tells Frodo he'd be better to stay in Buckland and never leave again. So they're ready to leave, but Maggot urges them to stay for dinner, and then promises to drive them to the ferry after dark to help them travel in secret. So part 4 is the ride to the ferry. They leave for the 5-mile drive to the ferry, bundled up against the foggy night. As they reach the ferry lane, they hear hoofs approaching. Frodo hides under blankets while the farmer and Sam prepare to defend him. But it's only Merry, come to see what had delayed them. They say goodbye to the farmer and proceed with Merry to the ferry. Merry to the farrier. Maggot then gives them a basket before he leaves. It's filled with hot mushrooms, the delight of the hobbits and misery for Zach and maybe for me. So that's basically the chapter. It's not long, and I suppose we could say that it isn't really important either. It just functions as a travelogue in a certain sense, how they got from point A to point B. Peter Jackson seems to have more or less thought so, as this is one of the episodes he pretty much completely omits. I went back and looked at the film just to see how it goes, the extended version even, and from the moment that Frodo and Sam leave home at about 44 minutes into the movie, until their arrival at Bree, before they get to Bree, they leave home at 44 minutes in, and they see elves going to leave Middle-earth, and they camp out, and that takes till 46 minutes and 40 seconds into the film. Then we skip to what Gandalf is doing at Orthanc, and we see the wizard duel there. That lasts till 51 minutes and 20 seconds in. Then we're back to the hobbits. They meet Merry and Pippin, who are actually in the act of raiding Farmer Maggot's crop, but they're only stealing carrots and cabbages, no mushrooms. Although then they see mushrooms growing on the path after they fall, which allows the title of the chapter to at least make an appearance in the dialogue. So props to Peter Jackson for that. Then they hide from the Nazgul at 54 minutes in, and they arrive in Bree at 58 minutes in, which is to say, we get 2 minutes and 40 seconds of the hobbits on the road before Gandalf's fight with Saruman. We get 2 minutes and 40 seconds with Merry and Pippin before the Nazgul shows up, and we get 4 minutes running away from the Nazgul for a total of 9 minutes and 20 seconds on the road between Hobbiton and Bree. I almost took that much time summing it up. Most of that is spent with conversation between Frodo and Sam while they travel, and then conversation with Merry and Pippin while they run from Farmer Maggot. And then most of it really is spent establishing that the Nazgul are legit scary. So Zach, I'm curious, now that you've read the book, which do you prefer? Or maybe don't say what you prefer, but, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these chapters in the Shire and how they are condensed in the films.
Yeah. In terms of preference, I can't say I prefer one over the other. It's because, well, one has it and one doesn't. So.
A diplomatic answer.
Yes, of course. You never know who's listening, right? But anyways, I had mentioned in the beginning Tolkien's gift for lore. And lore done well arguably is more compelling sometimes than the actual plots of these books. Not these books, but books in general, right? Mm-hmm. And there are one of the rules in my screenwriting class was, can it be shorter? Can you always make something shorter? Mm-hmm. And my professor, if he were adapting this, he would probably do the same thing and cut this chapter out.
Right.
But I don't know if I necessarily would because of the character interactions. Mm-hmm. Beautiful time for the characters to showcase their friendship, how it's being affected by the quest. But as a first-time reader, that was one of the things that struck me, was the time extension, as mm-hmm. it were, of the events. Because I was used to the rhythm and cadence of the movies, right? So Bilbo goes off after he puts the ring on and then gives it up, of course. It's given to Frodo to keep safe. Gandalf rides to Gondor, Minas Tirith, realizes it's the One Ring and comes back, right? It looks like maybe 2 or 3 weeks has passed.
Yeah.
In the books, 20 years has gone by. So I had to adjust to this,
right?
Very much so. But if I'm putting my film glasses on, I think that this would be a chapter that you put out, because if you do want to view it as such, it wouldn't move. It would probably slow the pacing of the film down. But as a book, I believe I would call it essential almost.
Yeah.
Because of those character interactions. So I love it because now I get to be immersed in the culture of the Shire. I get to see the Shire in the movies, right? But I don't get to live the Shire in the movies very much, if at all. Right. You mentioned it with the time codes. 45 minutes might sound like a long time, but in the right movie, it's actually not that much time.
Sure.
And I think Jackson understood. He's like, I've got 3 movies to work with here. If we're going extended edition, I've got about 12 hours to work with. I got to get moving.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, these were things that ended up on the chopping block. So, which is a very, very long-winded way of me saying I very much enjoyed this chapter because of those expansions on the lore. Right. You get to be immersed in the Shire a little bit more. You get to meet different personalities. Farmer Maggot's in the movies, or someone that has his lines, but he's not like this. He's just, no, Baggins is here, and closes the door, and that's it, right?
Right.
So again, it just the expansion of character and was great.
I think that I actually don't know if that is Farmer Maggot there, because we
They probably
hear
skipped
Farmer Maggot yelling at Merry and Pippin as they're running, and calling his dogs.
That's right.
But that's kind of his only appearance.
Oh,
Sort of
that's right. Yeah, forgive me. They
the
gave that line to him.
the
They gave
per,
Farmer Maggot's line to that guy, but you're right,
right,
Farmer Maggot, and you see his little scythe
right,
bobbing
right,
above the.
right. The parochial Georgic boogeyman, if you will,
Right.
if you will,
Yeah.
doesn't ever appear. Which I suppose preserves Frodo's impression of him. But yeah, one of the things that I appreciate more and more reading, these books, and then other, ancient literature. Although I just called Tolkien ancient literature. That's fun. Is the capacity of certain modes of writing to really accomplish something that I can only call cinematic. It does it. It paints it in your imagination. It paints it in the brain. But it's done with poetry. It's done with imagery. It's done sometimes with a lot of words. Sometimes with very spare words. But either way, it's a fun thing, I think, to live in an era where that word cinematic means something, and we can kind of apply it back to the impression that can be established, and sometimes more effectively with the written or the spoken or the sung word, but still to appreciate the visual media as well.
Very much so. I like they use that word cinematic because a lot of what you hear a lot in the Hollywood circles is how easily can we adapt this book? So if I were to read something, the first time I read parts of No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, that was like reading an actual screenplay, the book itself, right? Now this obviously lent itself to an adaptation, but the language is far different than Cormac McCarthy's. It's still like fuse and effect, but it's a different way of doing it. So I appreciate that.
And I've always assumed that it's partly because of Tolkien's profound adeptness with describing landscapes that that really inspired and drew Peter Jackson specifically to it, because it gave him a canvas on which it gave him a project with which to really introduce New Zealand and its landscapes, which are cinematic landscapes that had never been seen before. If anyway, so
definitely not that. I believe you're right. At least they certainly did not have the level of,
not to that broader audience.
Exactly, the level of not because now if I were to say to someone on the street New Zealand or Lord of the Rings, they would connect the two instantly.
Yeah.
So, anyways.
Anyway, that's really cool and helpful, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. Myself, even though, beyond just the established, well, I think this chapter is important for three reasons, and some of them overlap with yours. First, it actually introduces us to Farmer Maggot. And in Farmer Maggot, we get a picture of what a non-wealthy, not like Bilbo, basically, but entirely comfortable and respectable hobbit farmer looks like. Maggot and his family have to stand in for probably the vast majority of hobbit farms at the time, living simple, wholesome lives on their farms. So he's strikingly bold and competent, and he is one of the few characters in the entire book or legendarium to actually face down a ring wraith. And he's just a hobbit farmer with some dogs.
That's a great point. Wow.
So that I think is really critical. We see something of the hobbit, steel and strength that is kind of presented to us in a veiled way with the development of characters like Merry and Pippin and Frodo and Sam or Bilbo. But Maggot's already developed. He doesn't need any development. Maggot, you can imagine, marching off or sending his sons off to serve as archers in the wars of the High King at Fornost, 1,000 years before.
Sure.
He's a yeoman farmer with everything that goes along with that. So that's kind of cool. We get a chance to see that.
Yeah.
Without ever really being conscious that we're being shown that.
Another screenwriting principle, show, don't tell.
Right. So second, the changes to this chapter over the various drafts really highlight the substantial development in Tolkien's idea of the character that eventually becomes Frodo. So in the original draft, when Farmer Maggot shows up, Bingo Bolger Baggins, the then nephew and heir of Bilbo, responds very differently to the Frodo that he eventually becomes. I want to look at the notable bits of this interaction at this point as an example of what I'm talking about. But before we read this, I have to explain something that otherwise will be very confusing. Our cast of characters at this point in the drafting process of, that Tolkien went through is extremely different. The character that eventually becomes Frodo is called Bingo, but he's accompanied by two friends, neither of whom is Sam. They are named Frodo and Odo, and they are both Tooks. They're more or less combined, I think, into Pippin in the final version of the story. Some of their lines get allocated to Sam. So, as we read this, remember, when you hear Frodo saying something, it's not actually our Frodo. So with that said, Zach, would you read this passage from The Return of the Shadow, that Christopher Tolkien book that, from the history of the Middle-earth?
Of course. "There's Farmer Maggot's," said Frodo. "I think we will go round it," said Bingo, "and strike the lane on the far side of the house. I am supposed to have vanished, and I would rather not be seen sneaking off in the direction of Buckland, even by good Farmer Maggot." They went on, leaving the farmhouse away on their left, hidden in the trees several fields away. Suddenly a small dog came through a gap in the hedge and ran barking towards them. "Here, here, Jip Jip," said a voice. Bingo slipped on his ring. There was no chance for the others to hide. Over the top of the low hedge appeared a large, round hobbit face. "Hello, hello, and who may you be, and what may you be doing?" he asked. "Good evening, Farmer Maggot," said Frodo. "Just a couple of Tooks from away back yonder, and doing no harm, I hope."
So we're going to not read the whole thing. Farmer Maggot recognizes Frodo, not Frodo, but Frodo, and invites them to come in for a drink, and he tells them a very similar story to what we actually see in the chapter about a black rider coming to his gate and demanding for Mr. Bolger Baggins. He talks about the black rider's departure, and then he invites them to dinner, at which point they decline because they have to leave, and then something very strange happens. So go ahead and read again, Zach.
Farmer Maggot says, "Now I hope you and your friend will stay and have a bite and a sup with me and the wife." "Thank you very much," said Odo regretfully, "but I am afraid we ought to go on." "Yes," said Frodo, "we have some way to go before night, and really we have already rested too long. But it is very kind of you all the same." "Well, here's your health and good luck," said the farmer, reaching for his mug. But at that moment the mug left the table, rose, tilted in the air, and then returned empty to its place. "Help and save us," cried the farmer, jumping up. "Did you see that? This is a queer day, and no mistake. First the dog, and then me seeing things that ain't." "Oh, I saw the mug too," said Odo, unable to hide a grin. "You did you?" said the farmer. "I don't see no cause to laugh." He looked quickly and queerly at Odo and Frodo, and now seemed only too glad that they were going. They said goodbye politely but hurriedly, and ran down the steps and out of the gate. Farmer Maggot and his wife stood whispering at their door and watched them out of sight. "What did you want to play that silly trick for?" said Odo when the farmhouse was well behind. "The old man had done you a good turn with that rider, or so it seemed to me." "I dare say," said a voice behind him, "but you did me a pretty poor turn, going inside and drinking and talking and leaving me in the cold. As it was, I only got half a mug, and now we are late. I shall make you trot after this."
So, of course, that's Bingo, still invisible, although he takes the ring off shortly after. And he, done a little parlor trick with drinking the beer in front of the farmer and, being entirely impossible. So, anyway, as I said, this is one of the places where we see what a completely different character this Bingo has from Frodo. And also what a cavalier attitude he takes with the ring. That is, both Bingo and Tolkien himself in writing it this way. He's not quite taking it as seriously in the story at this draft. Using the ring for what is essentially a party trick, and an unkind one at that, is almost unimaginable for the Frodo we come to know. So what are your thoughts on this bit, Zach?
As I was reading it, and that's the first time I've ever read that, I got a very the Hobbit feel from it. The playfulness, mischievousness, and
Right.
it really struck in my head when he put the names Odo and Frodo next to each other. Because of course, as your listeners are very familiar with, in the beginning of The Hobbit, all the dwarves I think
Oh, right.
75% of their names rhyme with each other.
Right.
Um, Balin, Dwalin, Ori, Nori, Gloin. The others are escaping me, unfortunately.
Right.
But that playfulness with the language really stuck out to me, and um, yeah, he's essentially with the ring. Bingo, you said.
Bingo. It's like
Yeah, you said that.
Gandalf keeps on coming saying, "Bingo, my boy," and we're like, "No, this doesn't work." Anyway.
No. Tolkien thankfully realized for the greatest book of the 20th century
Mm.
um, that that attitude with the ring almost leaves with Bilbo when he leaves for Rivendell. If I did venture to say,
Yeah.
um, and obviously that idea or that almost ethos as it relates to the ring is preserved here a little bit. Just kind of it, if it is the one ring into which Sauron has poured all his hate and malice,
Yeah.
I believe it would be wise to not use it for a parlor trick such as this one.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's a fun point to see just on the development of the draft, though, because
Yeah.
that was, I think, the not the first draft, because the first draft really didn't get much farther than the end of the Unexpected Party. The second draft, you have Bingo, and it gets actually quite far as Bingo, and then it seems like it's later on that it. But it's very complicated. Tolkien's process, because he was effectively writing this from, I think, the mid 30s, late 30s until. Until the mid to late 40s. He spent 10 years drafting the book.
Wow. Okay.
As I recall. Anyway,
Yeah.
so before we get to the text, there's one more thing, a third thing that I think comes out in this chapter, or rather comes out in the original draft. So that original draft of the chapter was somewhat longer than the final version, and it included a lot of Hobbit conversations, something Tolkien found deeply amusing, but which his critics, including both C.S. Lewis and Rainer Unwin, the son of his publisher, evidently critiqued. Christopher Tolkien discusses this in the notes that follow the text in Return of the Shadow. There's one particular conversation that I think we need to read and discuss, even though it's going to seem maybe not completely, but almost completely pointless at first. So would you mind reading this, Zach?
Mm-hmm. I think I recognize these fields, said Frodo suddenly. They belong to old Farmer Maggot, unless I am quite lost.
Just to cut in, this is an excerpt from before what we just read. It just illustrates something different. So this is before they actually meet Maggot. So go ahead.
There ought to be a lane somewhere near that leads from his place to the road a mile or two above Buckland. Does he live in a hole or a house? Asked Odo, who did not know this part of the country.
And then they actually talk. Tolkien cuts in and gives some explanation about how hobbits had always lived in holes, but some of them live in houses, and a lot of that gets shifted to the introduction, actually. But continuing with the conversation.
He lives in a house, answered Frodo. There are very few holes in these parts. They say houses were invented here. Of course, the Brandybucks have that great burrow of theirs at Bucklebury, in the high bank across the river, but most of their people live in houses. There are lots of those new-fashioned brick houses. Not too bad, I suppose, in their way, though they look very naked, if you know what I mean. No decent turf covering, all bare and bony. Fancy climbing upstairs to bed, said Odo. That seems to me most inconvenient. Hobbits aren't birds. I don't know, said Bingo. It isn't as bad as it sounds, though personally I never like looking out of upstairs windows. It makes me a bit giddy. There are some houses that have 3 stages, bedrooms above bedrooms. I slept in one once long ago on a holiday. The wind kept me awake all night. What a nuisance. If you want a handkerchief or something when you are downstairs and find it is upstairs, said Odo. You could keep handkerchiefs downstairs if you wished, said Frodo. You could, but I don't believe anybody does.
And I'll take over here. So, that is not the house's fault, said Bingo. It is just the silliness of the hobbits that live in them. The old tales tell that the wise elves used to build tall towers, and only went up their long stairs when they wished to sing or look out of the windows at the sky, or even, perhaps, the sea. They kept everything downstairs, or in deep halls dug beneath the feet of the towers. I've always fancied that the idea of building came largely from the elves, though we use it very differently. There used to be 3 elf towers standing in the land away west beyond the edge of the Shire. I saw them once. They shone white in the moon. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone on a hill. It was told that you could see the sea from the top of that tower, but I don't believe any hobbit has ever climbed it. If ever I live in a house, I shall keep everything I want downstairs, and only go up when I don't want anything. Or perhaps I shall have a cold supper upstairs in the dark on a starry night. And have to carry plates and things downstairs if you don't fall all the way down, laughed Odo. No, said Bingo. I shall have wooden plates and bowls and throw them out the window. There will be thick grass all round my house. But you would still have to carry your supper upstairs, said Odo. Oh, well then, perhaps I should not have supper upstairs, said Bingo. It was only just an idea. I don't suppose I shall ever live in a house. As far as I can see, I am going to be just a wandering beggar. This very hobbit-like conversation went on for some time. So Zach, tell me, what do you think about this conversation? Do you agree with Lewis and Rainer Onion that if Tolkien had gone on like this, the whole enterprise would have been unendurable? And how do you feel about their apparent obsession with handkerchiefs and supper?
So I'm sure you remember not too long ago me discussing that I appreciate A Shortcut to Mushrooms because of the character expansions.
Yes.
What I'd like to expand upon now is that is character interactions done properly. So of course, his whimsy, his sense for fun is present, but there is a limit to that, of course. With a lot of things, and again, being the movie viewer, one of the wonderful things about Lord of the Rings is its tone.
Yes,
its tone is it's able to do all of the tones, right? And this one, I think, showcases one whose the tone would have been the same all the way through, or if he had tried to switch to something more serious, it wouldn't have worked as well. I do agree with Lewis and Unwin to an extent that if I was reading this, I'd be all right. I've heard about the handkerchief for the 3rd time. Do I need a 4th one, or do I even need all 3? But we don't, even though they're talking about preferences, I feel like we don't learn much about the characters, even just the smallest of idiosyncrasies, right? Essentially, comfortable people talking about comfortable problems, or first world problems, as it were, Hobbit world problems.
Right. This is like literally small talk. Just
yes.
kind of,
yes. Thank you. Duh.
Just, rambling on, seeing where it goes, teasing each other a little bit, but nothing serious, nothing material. What's interesting about that is Tolkien uses this to insert something that is perhaps, it's really one of the most important things to him. And it's kind of hiding in plain sight here. So, there's a lot of the stuff that came out in these early chapters, in these early drafts, that he, I think, pulls and puts in the introduction, explanations about hobbit houses and holes and the personalities and characters. All of that's fine, but the one thing that does also, survive, and it's in every map that he makes of the Shire, even though no one ever goes there, except in the epilogue, Sam's descendants ultimately settle in this place, and it's these elven towers that are just on the western edge of the Shire. And these towers, these are really important. And because they don't show up anywhere else, because they are effectively entirely irrelevant as far as we can see, it almost highlights their importance. So, Tolkien scholars, people who are really nerds about Tolkien, I guess is what I'm saying, whether they're professionally so or otherwise, know that he didn't really contribute a lot to his professional, or at least he took criticism for not contributing a lot to he's an English professor, but he didn't really contribute much to the field. He taught, but he was considered sometimes a brilliant lecturer, but he mumbled terribly. People kind of really had to already be devotees to get much out of him. But earlier on in his career, and about this time in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, he wrote an essay on the Beowulf poem that really transformed the field, and that transformation is still present, because at the time Beowulf was basically being read as the only not overtly Christian heroic Germanic poem in Old English, and no one really cared much about the story, but they were trying to discern what they could about the pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons and this and that, and effectively doing textual criticism without appreciating the story for what it was. Tolkien hated that, and he wrote The Monsters and the Critics to basically argue that, he begins with an allegory that for his criticism, and I want to read this aloud because this passage needs to be read at some point on this podcast. So he writes this, and he certainly had written this essay before he drafted this version of The Lord of the Rings. I'm 99% sure. So this is the allegory from his academic essay. He says, "A man inherited a field in which was an accumulation of old stone, part of an older hall. Of the old stone, some had already been used in building the house in which he actually lived, not far from the old house of his fathers, that older heroic hall. Of the rest of the stone, he took some and built a tower. But his friends, coming, perceived at once, without troubling to climb the steps of the tower, that these stones had formerly belonged to a more ancient building. So they pushed the tower over with no little labor in order to look for hidden carvings and inscriptions, or to discover whence the man's distant forefathers had obtained their building material. Some, suspecting a deposit of coal under the soil, began to dig for it, and forgot even the stones. They all said, 'This tower is most interesting.' But they also said, after pushing it over, 'What a muddle it is in.' And even the man's own descendants, who might have been expected to consider what he had been about, were heard to murmur, 'He is such an odd fellow. Imagine his using these old stones just to build a nonsensical tower. Why did he not restore the old house? He had no sense of proportion.' But from the top of that tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea." So his point in the essay is basically one should accept the Beowulf poem as a piece of art, doing something on purpose in its own right, and not simply try to take it apart to find remnants of the older poetic or religious tradition of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. But that idea of building something for the sake of seeing farther, and especially of trying to look on the sea, is something that was consistently important to Tolkien and reflects something of his own purpose in writing The Lord of the Rings at all. It is, I think, a message planted here, and in the final draft, in the introduction, for anyone that's willing to see it, that there is a greater purpose to this story, that it's intended to allow us to see more than we can see from our everyday reality. And that idea, of course, connects even to the name of the podcast here. We're named for Amon Sûl, which is another watchtower from which one might look far to see more than might otherwise be visible. And it connects even to our oft-repeated belief that there's a virtue in Tolkien's works that helps to orient us to what is highest and noblest. I am fairly certain I came up with that recognition mostly on my own, but there's a book that I talked about a couple episodes ago, The Worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien by John Garth, who's a relative newcomer to Tolkien studies. But basically he traveled around England especially, but even Europe, taking photos of the kind of landscapes that were important to Tolkien. So there's a whole section on how important the sea was to Tolkien, and he spent a lot of time visiting the sea, reflecting on it, And so it's got this beautiful image of the sea, the breaking on the rocks, here. Um, but this is something that Tolkien himself actually had painted over here. This image of a cove in Cornwall, again with the waves breaking on the rocks. So why it's important to him, it connects, it certainly inspires his imagination. He talks about this with Legolas and the sea longing coming upon him. This shows up later in the books. I don't, you haven't got to that part yet, Zach, but the sea is well. Enya sings the songs about going across the sea. It's there as well, and it even shows up, well, kind of skipping or rather going back to the prior chapter. We see the elves coming back from well, they're either on their way to somewhere or on their way back from, but it actually shows up in one of the other notes. In the companion to the Lord of the Rings, that the elves, they would still visit these three towers, and they were very important to them. It's on page 100 of the Lord of the Rings companion. Tolkien comments that Gildor and his elves were either on their way to or from the tallest of those towers, the one that Bingo is talking about, because there was a palantir there, a seeing stone, that only looked to the west. And sometimes, if elves would go there, they were granted a vision, and these are Tolkien's words, clear but remote, of Elbereth, of Varda, the Vala, as a majestic figure, shining white, standing upon the mountain, Oyolose, which I think is what we're seeing here, this mountain of Manwë, this vision of the utter west that the elves are longing for, which is maybe why they're singing a hymn to Elbereth on their way back. It's like, okay, there's a lot there, but this idea of these towers is a big deal to Tolkien, and this is John Garth's point about this, and he gives 2 pages here, because apparently at the time Tolkien was writing this, there was a nonsensical tower being built in Oxford, and it was like being discussed and argued about all over England, this pointless tower. So Tolkien uses that for his Monsters and the Critics thing. He uses it again here in The Lord of the Rings and retains it over many, many, many revisions. But I think it really does connect that desire to see the sea, to look out on something beautiful and glorious. It's important to him, and really I think it's what he's doing in this book in general. He's writing something that draws you in, that is humorous, that is beautiful, that is tear-jerking, but there's a larger point to it, and it's worthwhile for us to ask, even in a silly set of dialogue like that, or in a otherwise pointless chapter, perhaps pointless, like right. Shortcut to Mushrooms. What are we? What else should we be looking for here? What is the sea that this tower is built for us to be able to look at? So anyway, that's a lot of talking from me. I might be making more of this than there's actually there. I feel like there's something absolutely beautiful here, but it could just be me. What are your thoughts on all this, Zach, besides that Father Anthony is a huge nerd?
Well, I'd like to offer that when I fall in love with a piece of media as such, I need to know everything about it. So you are not a huge nerd. You're a wonderful fan.
Glory to God.
Exactly. Don't ask me about my metal bands. I know way too much about them. Anyway, I really appreciate that you shared that, because in passing, I had known that Tolkien had translated old poems. I think a couple summers ago, that movie, The Green Knight, came out, and I bought a copy of Tolkien's translation of it. And
very different, two completely different things.
Right. But I had known that he was that was one of his life pursuits, I guess.
Yeah.
But as we were reading that, I couldn't help but, think of something I had mentioned before, unfortunately, which is that idea of deconstruction. And what's the point of you have to ask yourself a couple questions. What is the point of the deconstruction? Why do I want to take this apart? Is the reason to take it apart worth pursuing?
Right.
Am I okay with what I find? If I do take it apart, am I going to be all right with it? And then finally, will I lose the original purpose of that work? And you'd mentioned tear jerking, and it really hit me when the sentence, but from the top of the tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea.
Yeah.
The pursuit, to a certain extent, I believe that the pursuit of all of us is to find what stirs our hearts, right? Yeah. And however we need to do that, or however we can attain that, is a lot of what motivates us, right? And so it goes to show the depths that Tolkien was paying attention and putting stuff in his work that would get the reader to remember that beauty is one of the main components of being human, right? And the oft quoted line by Dostoevsky, amongst Orthodox circles at least, is beauty will save the world.
Right.
Well, that's a reason why. Is I can't speak for, I can only speak for myself, but if I'm not having the best day, but the sun is out, that day's already much better. And I live in Toledo, Ohio. It's great quite frequently here, and the days where it's gray are definitely not as good as the days where the sun is out.
Sure.
So I appreciate that you brought my attention to that, because that's, God willing, that's going to inform my reading of the books moving forward, and especially stuff like the Silmarillion, the Fall of Numenor, and so on and so forth. That I appreciate knowing that was one of the ideals that Tolkien held dear.
Yeah, I think, as you say, that final line, it draws tear, but from the top of the tower, the man had been able to look out upon the sea. Tolkien, subtly, carefully, but he really is laying his heart bare at that. It's like, this is important. Anyone who builds something, it's not a vanity project, or hopefully it's not. This is, trying to see something. Anyway, he wanted to see the sea.
Yeah.
So,
you mentioned vanity projects, and I find it humorous that as we were reading that, I could think of two specific instances of pointless towers that which is kind of concerning, actually. I have instances of pointless towers in my life. They definitely could not see the sea, these ones.
Right.
But.
Now, having said this phrase, see the sea, so many times, I do have to at least make reference to a ridiculous Fred Astaire song from early cinema. I don't know if you watch any Fred Astaire musicals in your journey through movies, but
if you mention the names of the movies, I'd probably know that better than by their association with Fred Astaire.
I don't even remember what the movie is, but Fred Astaire sings it. It's a wartime movie, and he's a sailor, so he says, "We joined the Navy to see the world, and what did we see? We saw the sea."
Oh, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Unfortunately, I was never into musicals as a kid. The Fred Astaire era, as it sounds like it's the 30s and 40s, if I'm not mistaken.
Really, the 30s is the heyday.
Yeah, it was that was colored improperly for me by one of my early film professors, who called them drab. So I've stayed away from them, unfortunately. But
we're going far afield from Tolkien, but I would love to hear what you think of some of those Fred Astaire movies, because what he does with singing and dancing and storytelling, it's a different kind of tower, trying to see a different kind of thing, but there's a joy and an absolute beauty in that. Anyway,
because everyone has their own tower.
Right. I did not expect to end with Fred Astaire talking about this, but I think we need to move on. So with all that behind us, let's actually get to talking about this chapter itself as it was published. So We begin with Frodo waking and addressing himself to the food the elves had left. While he eats, he reflects on Gildor's advice to leave the Shire immediately and to bring any friends who are willing to come along with him, because Gildor perceives Frodo thinks he should leave by himself. As he thinks, he hears Pippin singing merrily and childishly as he runs on the green turf. So, Zach, would you read this passage as he... Yeah, go ahead.
No, I could not, he said to himself. It is one thing to take my young friends walking over the Shire with me until we are hungry and weary, and food and bed are sweet. To take them into exile, where hunger and weariness may have no cure, is quite another, even if they are willing to come. The inheritance is mine alone. I don't think I ought even to take Sam. He looked at Sam Gamgee and discovered that Sam was watching him. Well, Sam, he said, what about it? I am leaving the Shire as soon as ever I can. In fact, I have made up my mind now not even to wait a day at Crick Hollow, if it can be helped. Very good, sir. You still mean to come with me? I do. It is going to be very dangerous, Sam. It is already dangerous. Most likely neither of us will come back. If you don't come back, sir, then I shan't, that's certain, said Sam. Don't you leave him, they said to me. Leave him, I said. I never mean to. I am going with him if he climbs to the moon, and if any of those black riders try to stop him, they'll have Sam Gamgee to reckon with, I said.
So then they talk about elves for a bit, which is important, but we're short for time. And Frodo ends by saying,
I don't understand altogether, but I understand that Gandalf chose me a good companion. I am content. We will go together.
All right. So this passage reflects something of the thoughtful, careful, silent burden that Frodo carries, as mentioned by listener Josh in his email from earlier today. But I think it also provides something of the counter-argument against his criticisms of Sam. Sam is certainly not an educated, gentle hobbit, but there's a strength and dedication in him that must not be discounted. What do you think of this, Zach?
Mm-hmm. As this passage was brought into the foreground for me, I'm pleased because it my first impression was Sam is very different in the books than he is in the movies, right? But upon reading this, I'd like to revise that, actually. I think the essence of Sam is that strength that you just mentioned. Because Frodo says to him, and it sounds, and forgive me that I might have missed this detail, it sounds like Sam is, if not a lot younger than Frodo, maybe a little bit, maybe 20 years or so, give or take.
I would think 10 to 15 is probably a decent bet, maybe more. Frodo is 50 at this point, and I would bet Sam's in his 20s. I'm sure we could dig that up. I hadn't thought of double checking that.
No, it's so as a mentor, essentially, he warns him, it's going to be very dangerous. Sam, it is already dangerous. Most likely neither of us will come back. So in those first chapters, Tolkien established the comfort of the Hobbit life in, where Frodo comes from. Despite the gossipy nature of such, it is a comfortable life. And that's one that Sam had been living for, his entire life.
Yeah.
And it subtly, I think Frodo is appealing to that. They're saying, this is a place, that comfort is not something you most likely will be going back to.
Right.
And, this is where I get tear jerky a little bit, is Sam says, if you don't come back, then I won't either. Don't you leave him, which of course is in the movies at the end of Fellowship of the Ring. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee, nor do I mean to, right? Yeah. I'm going with him if he climbs to the moon. And of course, Sam seems, brave. He knows that he can't stand against a Black Rider if they are what they are, but it doesn't matter to him. Yeah. The short duration of their journey so far has already formed a bond that he is not willing to break, and that's a really beautiful thing to see.
Right. I hadn't made the connection until you said it, but this really is, this is Sam's moment to mirror Ruth with Naomi. Your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. I will not leave you. And again, tear jerking. You get misty eyed, like, okay, he's there for it.
He is, and sometimes fast friends are the best friends.
Yeah.
So, but,
Very good. All right, our next selection finds the hobbits at luncheon. We like to look in on them while they're eating. They had left just in time from the place where they had slept and breakfasted and struck out down the hill across the country. Then they'd seen a black rider atop the hill they had just left. At midday, they had finally begun to make some progress, getting out of the close undergrowth, and they felt that they'd lost their pursuers and could afford to rest. So I'll read this one. So, when they came to make their meal, they found that the elves had filled their bottles with a clear drink, pale golden in color. It had the scent of a honey made of many flowers, and was wonderfully refreshing. Very soon they were laughing and snapping their fingers at rain and at black riders. The last few miles they felt would soon be behind them. Frodo propped his back against the tree trunk and closed his eyes. Sam and Pippin sat near, and they began to hum and then to sing softly. And I'm going to take my life in my hands and try to make up a tune here. So, ho, 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 to the bottle I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. Rain may fall and wind may blow, and many miles be still to go. But under a tall tree I will lie, and let the clouds go sailing by. Ho, 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 they began again louder, and they stopped short suddenly. Frodo sprang to his feet. A long-drawn wail came down the wind, like the cry of some evil and lonely creature. It rose and fell and ended on a high, piercing note. Even as they sat and stood, as if suddenly frozen, it was answered by another cry, fainter and further off, but no less chilling to the blood. There was then a silence, broken only by the sound of the wind in the leaves. "And what do you think that was?" Pippin asked at last, trying to speak lightly but quavering a little. "If it was a bird, it was one I've never heard in the Shire before." "It was not bird or beast," said Frodo. "It was a call, or a signal. There were words in that cry, though I could not catch them. But no hobbit has such a voice." No more was said about it. They were all thinking of the riders, but no one spoke of them. They were now reluctant either to stay or go on. But sooner or later they had got to get across the open country to the ferry, and it was best to go sooner and in daylight. In a few moments they had shouldered their packs again and were off. So, I can see how Tolkien uses the scene to maintain the tension and also keep the hobbits moving along. The silly little drinking song lulls the reader into a sense of false security along with them, and then the Nazgul screams, the first that we encounter, but very much not the last. They jolt us from that delusion along with the hobbits. But Zach, I think you have a better sensitivity than I do to pacing and story development. What are your thoughts here?
I'll agree with you absolutely in that the chapters prior had been about the journey. Not that the rest of them aren't, of course, but the very minutia of the Shire itself, the beauty of the land that they're leaving behind. And you almost get the sense here that, ho, ho, to the bottle I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. That's where they want to stay, right?
Yeah.
But they are reminded right away, nope, you got to keep moving because you are carrying the prized possession of essentially the devil.
There we go.
And his agents are coming after you. And, from personal experience, the section is enhanced by having watched the movies, and the Nazgul's cry is, very, very much burned into my brain.
Yeah.
And the idea of them being bookended by two Nazguls is actually quite terrifying.
Right.
So, but your point about Tolkien lulling the reader into a sense of false security, I appreciate that because it's true. They've lived in the Shire their whole life. They are the masters of the Shire, right?
Yeah.
Even if they're haven't been all the way across, the culture seems to be pretty uniform across the Shire.
Right. It is their Shire, they say to Gildor, and he says, but it is not your Shire. Yeah.
Exactly. And this proves Gildor's point right away. But yeah, no, that song is one that made it into the films. I believe it might be in the extended edition.
It doesn't show up there, but I don't remember where it does show up.
Yes, there's maybe I'm misremembering, but there is an audio recording of some of the cast members singing that.
Okay.
Yes, when I just sang it now, that's the version I've heard, and so when I
Got you.
came upon this, the song started in my head, which was really cool. So that's been one of the joys of reading the books is some of the honoring of Tolkien's legendarium that was done. I get to put to the page now. So, anyways,
Beautiful. I'm guessing it's somewhere in the commentaries on the movies because I've not dug deep into the DVDs and all the material that are there,
um,
but that's
so
really neat.
yeah, it's in I believe it's in the extended edition of not the Hobbit, excuse me, the Fellowship,
Mm-hmm.
because they changed the end of the song.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah, because it's Pippin and Merry singing it while they're drinking in one of the bars.
Uh-huh.
So, or one of the taverns rather. So
That's really cool.
yeah.
Now I haven't done a full rewatch of the movies since I introduced them to my very purist sons a number of
Mm.
years ago. But I should watch them again without them so that I can avoid
Mhm.
the Mystery Science Theater commentary
Mhm.
and actually enjoy them.
Yeah, of course.
But as far as the Nazgul screams, I do want to say
Yes.
this is, I think, part of the slow unveiling of the terror of the Nazgul.
Mm.
Because
Okay.
up to this point, in the books, they've just been, presented as like a bundle of cloth riding on a black horse.
Mhm.
Strange, unusual, but sinister. But the most frightening thing they've done so far is sniff. And
Mm.
Pippin, actually,
That's
we
right.
didn't read it, but Pippin is fixated on their sniffing. He's like, "Did you ask him about the sniffing? I think that's important." Um,
Oh yeah.
and actually, in the original draft of this, which we also didn't look at, the
Mhm.
same scene happens where they're sitting at, eating their lunch. They don't hear screams, but they hear sniffs, like around them, like invisible sniffs, and that
That's
freaks
almost
them out,
that's almost more unsettling if
right?
I'm honest.
Because it's like there's something invisible. So like the
Yeah.
Black Rider, took off its clothes, and then it's
Mhm.
completely invisible, and it's close to them, so they rushed off, but it can't follow them well. I
Mm.
think the screams are probably more effective and appropriate,
Sure.
um, but the screams are what convey the terror, and the
Yeah.
absolute, that melts, full grown men of war
Mhm. Yeah.
in the Two Towers and Return of the King,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
seeing the hobbits react to that is
Yeah.
really striking. So
And that these screams are not just animalistic, because I believe Frodo mentions it
right,
sounds like words.
yeah, there are
That
words in it. It's like,
yes,
okay,
that's
it's a
so
communication.
correct. So, anyways.
Hmm. All right. Finally, or maybe not finally, we have two more bits. But we need to see how Peter Jackson actually did Merry and Pippin dirty, making them the immature raiders on Farmer Maggot's fields, when in fact the guilt for those malefactions rested upon someone else entirely. Zach, would you read this passage?
Mhm. They passed along the edge of a huge turnip field and came to a stout gate. Beyond it, a rutted lane ran between low, well-laid hedges towards a distant clump of trees. Pippin stopped. "I know these fields and this gate," he said. "This is Bamfurlong, old Farmer Maggot's land. That's his farm away there in the trees." "One trouble after another," said Frodo, looking nearly as much alarmed as if Pippin had declared the lane was the slot leading to a dragon's den. The others looked at him in surprise. "What's wrong with old Maggot?" asked Pippin. "He's a good friend to all the Brandybucks. Of course, he's a terror to trespassers and keeps ferocious dogs. But after all, folk down here are near the border and have to be more on their guard." "I know," said Frodo, "but all the same," he said with a shamefaced laugh, "I am terrified of him and his dogs. I have avoided his farm for years and years. He caught me several times trespassing after mushrooms when I was a youngster at Brandy Hall. On the last occasion, he beat me and then took me and showed me to his dogs. 'See, lads,' he said, 'next time this young varmint sets foot on my land, you can eat him. Now see him off.' They chased me all the way to the ferry. I have never gotten over the fright, though I dare say the beasts knew their business and would not really have touched me." Pippin laughed. "Well, it's time you made it up, especially if you are coming back to live in Buckland. Old Maggot is really a stout fellow. if you leave his mushrooms alone. Let's get into the lane, and then we shan't be trespassing. If we meet him, I'll do the talking. He's a friend of Mary's, and I used to come here with him a good deal at one time.
So I think perhaps that is the most mature that Pippin ever sounds in the books, as he gently undertakes to admonish Frodo. Now, maybe that's not quite fair to him. He's certainly in his element, in his Shire, as we said, and very far from his fool of a took moments in Moria or in Rohan. What do you think of this, Zach, and of the sins of Frodo's youth?
I did think of that fool of a took moment in Moria. Throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity. So it's cool to see Pippin depicted as being maybe semi more competent and less childlike. Actually, I don't know if it's the poor actor's face by Billy Boyd, but I got the sense that Pippin's more of a child than the other ones in the movie.
Yeah, it's one of the criticisms I have of the movie is that Merry and Pippin and really Gimli kind of get used mostly for comic relief, and certainly I can see how the movie can use that, but it's not. The characters got done dirty there, and in Gimli's stupid drunk scene with Legolas, and I didn't need those scenes, but anyway. But you were saying about this scene.
So it's the idea of Frodo being a malcontent, as it were, in his younger years is definitely at odds with my childhood impression of him in the films. He quite clearly says to Gandalf, "Before you came along, us Bagginses were very well respected." And this this very much flies in the face of that. As, but what's cool about that too is Frodo knows that, looking back, he knows that the dogs probably wouldn't have eaten him. That Farmer Maggot was just kind of teaching him a lesson, as it were, right? It's, this isn't yours, don't mess with it.
Right.
And, for lack of a better term, quick spanking and you're on your way, right?
Yeah.
You never do it again. It made the impression, and he learned a bit of a lesson. So it's, again, an expansion of the character sketch of Frodo that I received from just watching the films. So.
Right, we get a lot. He's a rounder character for this. For this instance, we can see also, he's not just a bookworm or whatever who gets saddled with a task and does it. We see there's some spark in him, some mischief. All of the different aspects of Hobbit, of Hobbit character.
Maybe a trace of Bingo still left in him.
There we go. And maybe even that's part of the role then moving forward of Pippin and Merry in the movies or the books, I guess, that they show that, well, especially with an older Frodo in the books, they show that other part of his personality that really doesn't get to show up much because they're part of his past. He was a Hobbit tween once as well.
Yes, very much so.
The other association that just crossed my mind as we were reading this is I wonder if Tolkien didn't have in his mind that over-quoted scene from St. Augustine's Confessions about stealing pears when he was young, not because he liked pears, but because it was just a thing to do. But who knows? Yeah. All right. This, I think, is finally we need to give Farmer Maggot full credit. When he tells them about the Black Rider's visit to his farm, asking after Baggins, and he says it when he's telling them the story, Frodo is visible, this time not like in the early draft. Maggot mentions almost being run down by the rider's horse after he tells him to go away, and then setting his dogs on the rider to chase him off his land. So he's pretty thoroughly aware that the riders are dangerous, although he certainly doesn't imagine how very much so they are. But nonetheless, he volunteers to give Frodo and his companions a ride to the ferry in the dusk and in the fog. It's a brave thing to do, but his behavior when they hear hooves approaching is braver still. Zach, would you read this?
They reached the entrance to the ferry lane at last. It was marked by two tall white posts that suddenly loomed up on their right. Farmer Maggot drew in his ponies and the wagon creaked to a halt. They were just beginning to scramble out when suddenly they heard what they had all been dreading: hooves on the road ahead. The sound was coming towards them. Maggot jumped down and stood holding the ponies' heads and peering forward into the gloom. Clip clop, came the approaching rider. The fall of the hoofs sounded loud in the still, foggy air. "You better be hidden, Mr. Frodo," said Sam anxiously. "You get down in the wagon and cover up with blankets, and we'll send this rider to the rightabouts." He climbed out and went to the farmer's side. Black riders would have to ride over him to get near the wagon. Clop, clop. The rider was nearly on them. "Hello there," called Farmer Maggot. The advancing hooves stopped short. They thought they could dimly guess a dark, cloaked shape in the mist, a yard or two ahead. "Now then," said the farmer, throwing the reins to Sam and striding forward. "Don't you come a step nearer. What do you want, and where are you going?" "I want Mr. Baggins. Have you seen him?" said a muffled voice. But the voice was the voice of Mary Brandybuck. A dark lantern was uncovered, and its light fell on the astonished face of the farmer. "Mr. Mary," he cried. "Yes, of course. Who did you think it was?" said Mary, coming forward.
You'll never guess.
Right. As he came out of the mist and their fears subsided, he seemed suddenly to diminish to ordinary hobbit size. He was riding a pony, and a scarf was swathed round his neck and over his chin to keep out the fog. Frodo sprang out of the wagon to greet him. "So there you are at last," said Mary. "I was beginning to wonder if you would turn up at all today, and I was just going back to supper. When it grew foggy, I came across and rode up toward Stock to see if you had fallen in any ditches. But I'm blessed if I know which way you have come. Where did you find them, Mr. Maggot? In your duck pond?" "No, I caught him trespassing," said the farmer, "and nearly set my dogs on him. But they'll tell you all the story, I have no doubt. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mr. Mary and Mr. Frodo and all, I'd best be turning for home. Mrs. Maggot will be worriting with the night getting thick." He backed the wagon into the lane and turned it. "Well, good night to you all," he said. "It's been a queer day, and no mistake. But all's well as ends well, though perhaps we should not say that until we reach our own doors. I'll not deny that I'll be glad now when I do." He lit his lanterns and got up. Suddenly, he produced a large basket from under the seat. "I was nearly forgetting," he said. "Mrs. Maggot put this up for Mr. Baggins with her compliments." He handed it down and moved off, followed by a chorus of thanks and good nights. They watched the pale rings of light round his lanterns as they dwindled in the foggy night. Suddenly, Frodo laughed. From the covered basket he held, the scent of mushrooms was rising.
So, of course, we had to read that bit, if only to explain the chapter title, as these are the mushrooms that come at the end of the chapter about the shortcut. But Farmer Maggot, more than half convinced that a black rider is approaching, leaves his wagon with no dogs to back him, no weapon that we can see, to defend his guests. He can't know what he might be facing, but still, it's a remarkable gesture of hospitality and courage, or so it seems to me. What do you think, Zach?
Yes, you mentioned Hobbit steel earlier in our discussion, and that's the prime example thus far that I can see. And before I go any further, I did want to harken back just a bit to your discussion of Tolkien's gift for visual imagery.
Mm-hmm.
It says, "They watched the pale rings of light round his lanterns as they dwindled into the foggy night."
Yeah.
That is a sentence that is almost tailor-made for the storyboard artists, the concept arts of whomever would be working on these films. It's just a beautiful bit of writing. But I think that Farmer Maggot's defense of his guests is, as you said, remarkable. It's obviously, if we're starting to get a sense of the terror of the Nazgul or the Black Riders, and our perception of the threat is increasing, then by that same token, if Farmer Maggot is going to stand up to them, we're like, oh, this isn't just, a sniffer, as it were. These are beings that are dangerous.
Yeah.
And so we can tell that Farmer Maggot has very good, stout values, right? These are my guests. These are my essentially friends now, right? They're hobbits like me, and I will defend them because they've been under my roof, essentially. The other thing that I picked up on it on this reread right here is the gift of the mushrooms is besides being humorous, of course, it's a sign of connection.
Mm-hmm.
At least as far as I can tell, that Farmer Maggot knows what Frodo did when he was young.
Yes.
He knows that, he sent him on his way had the dogs chase after him, whatever. But I can almost, see in my mind's eye him kind of chuckling to himself as he sees Frodo scurrying away as a kid, saying, "Oh, that little rabble rouser." But the connection is there; it's built, and this is a testament to that. I neglected to mention this earlier in the podcast, unfortunately, but our mutual spiritual father, Father Dimitri, Father Dimitri Tonias, he when he was recommended to me at the seminary to be my spiritual father, I was waiting for him, and he walked in, and he said, "You're here to see me?" I said, "Yep." And he was carrying a Star Wars lunchbox, and it was of The Force Awakens. And so I sat down. I mentioned, I like your lunchbox. I don't like the movie it came from, but I revealed my opinion of The Last Jedi, and he and I would go back and forth on The Last Jedi for up to this day.
Yep.
This is the same idea, if I'm not mistaken. That connections between people can be built on almost anything,
right?
And this is Maggot affirming that he protects Frodo and his friends, because he knows that, you tried to steal my mushrooms. Now I'm giving not only my mushrooms to you, but I'm offering my life and my protection,
right?
Which is again, I apologize to the listeners if I sound like a broken record, but this just utter belief in the goodness of people to stand up for each other, or to quote scripture, what better gift than that for one to lay down his life for his friends,
right?
So
I think maybe too, weirdly, the gift of the mushrooms is almost like a commissioning gift. Like, now you're an equal. Now what you stole, now I will send you off on whatever quest you are on. Hopefully, it's just to find your way to the door. It could be a welcome gift because he thinks he's going to stay, but also, Frodo's not behaving like someone that's just going to come and settle.
Right.
And Maggot, in a sense, it's like, okay, what you once stole, now receive from an open hand, and may it give you strength for the journey to come. It certainly functions that way, whether Maggot knows it or not. But the other thing we find out is Maggot is we say he's kind of our example of hobbits, but he's actually rare because he's one of the few that goes over into the Old Forest. Have you gotten to the Old Forest in your reading yet?
Is that right before Tom Bombadil?
Yeah.
Yes, where the tree.
Right.
Yes.
But Maggot is one of the few hobbits that Bombadil knows and seems to interact with, which means Maggot knows Bombadil, and that means Maggot knows more of the wide world than a lot of hobbits do. So,
yes.
So it's kind of an interesting. A gift from Farmer Maggot, protection from Farmer Maggot is no small thing.
Point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, and this is what we've been talking about. The attention to detail that Tolkien put into this is just remarkable. Yeah. Maggot in 95% of other stories would have been a throwaway character, and now I feel like I know him.
Right.
So,
and if I'm not mistaken, we see him again at the end in the Scouring of the Shire, which you haven't got to yet, and we see him, once again. Anyway, more that we can say, but good. All right. With that, I think we should wrap this up. Not a long chapter, but a wonderfully, delightfully long conversation. There was a lot to talk about. Thank you for trespassing on Maggot's farm with me, Zach.
Nobody else to do it with.
All right. So, we all love reading Tolkien, Movies and maybe video games are fine, but the books are paramount for us here. It's always interesting to hear how people interpret them reading out loud. So for this segment, I'm asking you, Zach, to pick a favorite passage or just a passage that really jumped out to you as you're reading through for the first time and read it to us. So what did you pick and what did you like about it?
All right. So I actually picked a section because we had honed in on Shortcut to Mushrooms for our discussion today. I picked one from actually Sam at the beginning of the chapter. So they had just woken up and they were talking about their experience the night before with the elves. So
Right.
all right, let's see. They seem a bit above my likes and dislikes, so to speak, answered Sam slowly. It don't seem to matter what I think about them. They are quite different from what I expected, so old and young, and so gay and sad, as it were.
What jumps out to you in that? Why is that what you would pick?
So I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the exposures to Lord of the Rings that I had outside of the films was clips of the Ralph Bakshi version or Bakshi version. And I apologize if this sounds cruel, and I don't mean it to, but that movie portrays Sam as almost someone who's simple.
Yeah.
And that idea was a little in the back of my head as I started reading the books, because in the opening chapters, Sam seems to fall more in line with that characterization than the one from the Peter Jackson films.
Sure.
And when I read that, and when I read that passage, I realized that most certainly was not the case. That is a very deep reflection upon an experience that he had only the night prior. And if I'm not mistaken, he had told Frodo that one of the things he was most excited about was maybe meeting elves, correct?
Yeah.
As they were leaving. And so he's had that experience now. And so you think of someone who's, I guess, for example, my school just won a national championship, Ohio State. I've experienced it before, but maybe somebody else hasn't. So you go ask them, what does it feel like?
Right.
I've finally gotten there, right? And he says, they seem a bit above my likes and dislikes, so to speak.
Right.
He's a reverence for them.
Immediately.
Right. It's very evident right away. And it reminds me of a time I spoke to one of my friends, and I asked him something about God and Christ and how he interpreted it. And he goes, really, who am I to judge the creator of the universe? Now, of course, the elves aren't, Iluvatar, but, I'm getting the same sense of reverence present that Sam has. He says, it don't seem to matter what I think about them. Again, that is not a thought of a simple person.
No.
No, that is someone that understands that while they themselves are not throwaway, but they do have a place in the world. They have a role to play, as it were. And again, he says, they're so old and young and so gay and sad, as it were. Not a thought that I would have if I had interacted with the elves, I assure you. He recognizes that for all of the reverence, for all of this presentation of them as almost angelic beings. And I know that Gandalf's, the Istarian, is it the Valar? Forgive me, I haven't gotten that deep yet. But
that's all right.
They're considered the more angelic beings in the Legendarium.
Right. Your Valar are sort of your high angels. Your Maya are sort of your messenger angels of some sort. Gandalf and Sauron and Saruman are all Maya in their origins.
It's recognizing that for their status as something as such, they are still susceptible to things as old age, where the world, where they're tired, right? Where they are happy, but there is a sadness to them there as well. So, unfortunately, I had to reveal my lack of deep dive into the works yet. But
that's all right. You'll get there.
Of course, and I was so struck by that passage, and
Yeah.
I knew I had to bring it up to you today. So
Well, and I'd never really noted that you bring up that it really is a profoundly insightful and discerning thing for Sam to say. He perceives the nature of the elves just in one night, and he has the humility to recognize that and to relate it to himself, to honor it, to love it, and to be moved by it, and then to be able to express it in what actually is poetic terms, because strangely, although we don't really pay attention to it, it's kind of again hidden in plain sight. But Sam of the four hobbits, Sam is the poet on the
Mm,
trip. Um,
okay,
so uh,
wow.
so
And if I may, I do have a question as
sure.
someone who's new, but uh, to pose to someone who is not new to the books.
Mm.
Uh, as I've been reading, and it's evident in the films to a certain extent,
Mm-hmm.
in Tolkien's world, the elves seem to be, if not the most magical of the creatures, almost just elevated.
Sure.
It's this isn't exactly analogous, but bear with me here. Almost like prelapsarian humans,
Sure.
give or take, right? There's this innate magical quality to them. So everything that they do has a twin in human behavior, but the elven version is almost blessed or angelic, right? Um,
It comes across that way, certainly.
Yes. So I'm thinking of in Fellowship of the Ring, the film, when
Mm-hmm.
they're walking on the snowy pass, Legolas is on top of the snow and everyone is
Right.
buried underneath it, working through, right? Um, One of my friends' criticisms of the Hobbit films is Legolas defies gravity in a few of those sequences, which yes, but also he is shown as being lighter than everybody else, and
Sure.
that's not me making an excuse for the Hobbit films. That's a very different conversation.
We
But
don't need to go there.
no, not tonight. But I just was curious, what is it with the elves? They have this magical quality to them that they are probably a higher being than humans. That would be a good way of putting my question. So,
So it's a great question, and one that I could probably talk about for a long time, because I think this is one of the things that Tolkien is trying to look at from his tower.
mm,
Um,
okay.
because the thing about the elves is they are apparently immortal, but actually not actually immortal.
Hmm.
Their life is bound to the life of the world. So
Mm.
they end when it ends, and they have no hope or expectation of a life other than that.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but elves and humans are in the lore that the elves have received from the Valar. They are the two races of the children of Ilúvatar. They are
Hmm.
his particular uh, addition to the world that otherwise he is basically allowed to be shaped by the Valar themselves. But when
Hmm.
they are constantly at war amongst themselves, all of the other Valar with Morgoth and the
Hmm.
Maya that side with him, uh, then the children of Ilúvatar are the new addition that ultimately brings about a resolution to the conflict. But
Okay.
that resolution happens off screen. It's
Okay.
portrayed, it's prophesied in the music of the Ainur even
Mhm.
before the creation of the world actually happens. But how it all works isn't actually clear. So as you read, looking at, yeah, okay, the elves are apparently higher, apparently loftier. The thing to be struck by, the thing to be wrestling with is, but the elves are fundamentally, irrevocably
Mhm.
mortal, where humans who die, who are apparently extremely short lived, do have a promise and expectation of actual immortality.
Mm.
Humans have a
Okay.
lore that says they were created to live absolutely forever.
Mhm.
And There's a line that only comes up in the appendices when Aragorn says, "We are not bound to the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory."
Okay.
So elves are apparently higher, but
Okay.
actually, cosmically, in their destiny and their purpose, humans are higher than them. So if there's a little bit of, humans are, angels are angels, but humans are created and called to be higher than the angels, as we sing
Right.
about the Virgin Mary, more honorable than the cherubim, right?
Exactly.
So there's a little bit of that present there, but elves aren't angels. They are not more distant from the earth. They are absolutely, intrinsically, inescapably connected to it, and therefore, after long years, they are fairly perfectly in harmony with it, which I think is what's going on with Legolas, treading lightly on the snow and so forth.
Oh, that's
But
wonderful. Oh,
but there's
okay.
there's a lot. This is, in a sense, the Frodo and Sam, we said, are sort of the two poles
Yeah.
there, but on a much larger level, elves and humans are the two poles around which the whole legendarium is written, and
Hmm.
therefore it's extremely important anytime an elf and a human marry.
Hmm.
And it only happens, 4 times,
Oh,
basically.
wow. I didn't know it was that infrequent.
And you could maybe argue that there's a fifth or a sixth off screen,
Okay.
but off screen.
Sure.
But Aragorn and Arwen's marriage
Mhm.
is profoundly important.
Yeah. I was going to follow up, and we probably don't have time for this, but one of the main dramatic conflicts of the films, at least, that Jackson brought over from the books, is Arwen deciding to give up immortality.
Right.
So the question then becomes, if she decides to give up her mortality and marry Aragorn and bear children with him, does that mean that then the idea that the idea of something after is then open to her in
Yes.
exchange for her immortality? Is that how it goes?
That's where the line is, where the line comes in. Aragorn is dying, and he says, "We are not bound by the circles of the world, and beyond them is more than memory." So she
Mm-hmm.
loses the heritage, the birthright of the Eldar, of the elves, but what she gains is unknown,
Mm-hmm.
and uncertain, but still something real. And the fascinating thing is that this interplay between the elves and humans is the one place where Tolkien reflects and meditates on a effectively, his meditation on this brings him to, or rather, he has a character, an elf in the Silmarillion, who's conscious of this, thinking about this, trying to deduce what in the world is going to happen effectively, and his conclusion basically is a anticipation, a prophecy of the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first appearance on this podcast back in
Mm-hmm.
2019, talking about. So just so you're aware, most of the story of Aragorn and Arwen doesn't happen in the main narrative of the Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
Peter Jackson pulls more into the movie than is actually there in the narrative. Where he
Mm-hmm.
pulls it from, and not it really, the way in which he does this is one of my big problems with the movie,
Mm-hmm.
because he gets it wrong at something at a critical point. But it's in the
Mm-hmm.
appendices, the whole story of Aragorn and Arwen. But
Okay.
Tolkien wrote a companion piece to go with that was supposed to be in the Silmarillion. That is this
Mm-hmm.
conversation between an elf man and a human woman in the time of the Silmarillion, which is basically them talking about human mortality, elven immortality,
Mm-hmm.
and how all of that works, and the two go together. And unfortunately, that second piece wasn't published in the original Silmarillion. It only shows up in I think volume 10 or 12 of History of Middle Earth, the one
Wow.
called Morgoth's Ring.
Okay.
But anyway, Father Andrew and I talked about that in, I think, episode 4 of this podcast.
Wow.
So,
I'll have to go back and listen then.
but anyway, I could
no,
talk about this for hours, and I
yeah,
need
yeah.
not to. But yeah.
Yes, thank you for indulging me. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you for sharing that, your reflections on Sam's first encounter with elves. That's beautiful. But now it's time for a little segment that we like to call They're Taking the Hobbits to Isengard. So, Zach, now is the time when you and I get to play for absolutely no prizes, a little game which will test whether we are true Tolkien fans, whom everyone should listen to, or whether we just wasted 2.5 hours and counting of everyone's time. The format here is one that I inherited from my dad and his brothers, who used to play this trivia game with each other when I was young. So the game is this. We will each, in turn, read a quote from Tolkien's works, and the other has to tell who the speaker is. Bonus points if we can give the context as well. The rules for the quotations are as follows. It needs to be an actual quotation by an actual named character. No narrator gotchas, no the crowds, people said this or that. It needs to be, so 2, it needs to be a full sentence or a sentence fragment if that's all that is quoted. And 3, it has to only be taken from The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So I'll give you an example from something you haven't seen yet. The quote comes from the chapter, The Council of Elrond, and the quote is, "There let it lie until the end." Now, within the legendarium, the person who says the line is Saruman, but it's actually spoken by Gandalf, who's recounting this conversation at the council. So, let the player beware. So, and yes, the other part of this is you get to try to stump me as well. And since you're a first-time reader, I'm going to give you the advantage. You'll give me 3 quotations, and I'll give you 2. And furthermore, I will limit myself to this chapter and the 3 before it. For you, it's open season. You can pick anything you like from The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings. This is your chance to humiliate me galore. So if we get 3 or more right between the 2 of us, we survive. If not, well, then the Uruk-hai make a meal of us, and meat is back on the menu,
boys.
So, are you ready?
You're going to slap me around the proverbial schoolyard, as it were, but I'm going to try and get you. I promise.
All right. So you start, and then I'll tell you what my category for you is. So, Lay it on me. What do we got? Just the quote. Go ahead.
My friend, you had horses and deeds of arms and the free fields, but she, born in the body of a maid, had a spirit and courage at least the match of yours. Yet she was doomed to wait upon an old man, whom she loved as a father, and watch him falling into a mean, dishonored dotage, and her part seemed to her more ignoble than that of the staff he leaned on.
So you gave more of that than I would have or will, but that is Aragorn speaking to Éomer. In, I think, the Houses of Healing. I think.
Okay.
Am I right or am I wrong?
Unfortunately, it is Gandalf.
Oh, that was the other possibility.
Yes.
Excellent.
My friend, said Gandalf, you had horses and deeds of arms, and so on and so
Good.
forth.
Well, I mean, bad, because we're,
the Uruk-hai
one of 2 away from... all right, so... here is mine for you. Boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble.
Oh, man. If I had to guess, that sounds like Mary before they get on the ferry.
Decent enough, but no. That is the gaffer in the first inn that we see within like 2 pages of the book's beginning.
Yeah.
So the fuller context, you shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandy Man, said the gaffer, who did not much like the miller. They're talking about the death of Frodo's
Right.
parents. There
Right.
isn't no call to go talking of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough, for those that still sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble. Anyway, there was this Mr. Frodo, left an orphan. So, all right.
And
And
again, this is where your listeners are like, "Wow, I would be better at this than Zachary."
well, that's what
That's
makes it fun. And hopefully that
exactly,
makes them want to write me an email saying, Father Anthony, let me come on as a guest host
of course.
because I'm looking
And
for
the
more.
gaffer is Sam's father, right?
That's right.
Okay, cool.
So, and I forgot to tell you, and this maybe is a foul on my part, the category that I have for you today is Hobbit Conversations.
Okay. No fouls here. That's all right.
So, anyway,
Well,
your next one for me.
all right. Eowyn is safe now, but you, Wormtongue, you have done what you could for your true master. Some reward you have earned at least. Yet Saruman is apt to overlook his bargains. I should advise you to go quickly and remind him, lest he forget your faithful service.
Well, now I'm careful. Because I was so sure that was Aragorn, and I was so wrong. I think that this is also Gandalf, though.
Yes.
All
You're
right.
correct. Yep.
Whew. We're still
Yes.
alive.
That's good. Thank God.
All right.
And here's where I kill us.
Well, let's see.
Hobbit conversations.
All right. Here's yours. Shortcuts make delays, but inns make longer ones.
So that's most certainly from the chapter we read today. Oh man. I want to say that's Frodo because Pippin's trying to make the case for the inn and Frodo says no.
There we go. It was a softball, but you are correct.
I appreciate the softball.
All right. And now for our legs and our lives. What's your last one for me?
All right. For Mithril, the wealth of Moria was not in gold and jewels, the toys of the dwarves, nor in iron their servant. Such things they found here, it is true, especially iron. But they did not need to delve for them. All things that they desired they could obtain in traffic.
So I'm really tempted to say it's Gandalf again, and you gave me 3 of Gandalf, but I think that's a trick. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess Gimli.
It is actually Gandalf.
Oh!
So I didn't realize it until I read that I picked all Gandalf quotes.
Wow. And I flubbed it. So
No.
there we go. There we go. No congratulations to us. It seems that we've both been looted and half-eaten by the Uruk-hai.
But it was fun still.
There we go. And maybe more fun than being carried by whatever his name. For pity's sake, I'm forgetting the Uruk-hai's name. It's been too long. Anyway, good luck to us in Isengard.
Yes, right.
It was Lurtz in...
Lurtz.
It was Lurtz in the movies, but
then he gets his head cut off by Aragorn.
Right. Now I'm questioning whether it was Lurtz in the... Oh, my goodness.
Is he named? Are they named in the books?
I believe so.
Okay.
I'm thinking Shagrat and Gorbag, but those are, I think, the 2 orcs in Mordor. Anyway,
yes.
Well, whoever's eating us, we got et. All right, and that's all we've got for today. Thank you, Zach, for co-hosting the Amon Sûl podcast with me today, and I want to give a shout out to, again, as you said, our shared mentor and spiritual father, Father Demetrius Tonius. I was the first priest that he mentored, and I believe you are the last seminary graduate, and God willing, someday priest.
Yes.
And may the Lord grant him health and joy. But Father, if you're listening, hello from 001 and whatever number you might end up being.
I think we figured out I would be 013 or 14. I believe is what we figured out one day.
There you go. Forgive the inside baseball, dear listener, but Zach, truly a joy to get to sit and chat with you again. And thanks for all that you brought today. It was wonderful.
No, I sincerely appreciate the invitation. I don't get to talk about my intense love for these works as much as I would like to. And I appreciate the insights that you brought, because they're only going to enrich my reading of the book moving forward and everything afterwards. So,
well, I know I'd love to have you come back on again, maybe after we finish with Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Wights, because all of that is also stuff that was omitted, and that would be a nice chance, kind of as we arrive at Bree, to kind of finish the conversation we had about those 8 minutes and 9 minutes and 20 seconds, and what all was lost. So
it would be a privilege.
A privilege. Anyway, next time on Amon Sûl, I'll be joined by Richard Barrett, returning to the show after 5 years, and we'll be talking about our next chapter, A Conspiracy Unmasked. So I look forward to that. I hope our listeners do as well. You can send your questions and comments and topic suggestions or orcish ideas for their taking the hobbits to Isengard to me at amonsûl@ancientfaith.com. You can also message me through the podcast Facebook page. At those addresses, and especially at the email, we also welcome guest co-host proposals. So if you have a chapter that you'd like to discuss with us, please make a pitch. Lastly, we would love to receive more photograph submissions of landscapes that resemble Weathertop and the Weather Hills approaching it. The photo that currently features during the podcast opening on YouTube is the submission of listener Jordan Brown, but we'd love to grow our portfolio. So if you live or work or commute in the vicinity of Amon Sûl, please share your view with us.
If you want more of this kind of thing, subscribe to the Amon Sûl podcast on your favorite podcast app. And please rate and review. And look up the Amon Sûl podcast page on Facebook. Click the follow button. But most of all, though, share with your friends. And while you're at it, if you appreciate this or other Ancient Faith media, go to ancientfaith.com/support and show some practical love.
We have been around actually since 2019. You can find our full back catalog of episodes by going to, believe it or not, TolkienPodcast.com. Father Andrew found that domain unclaimed and snapped it up. Or, you can just subscribe on your podcast app. The Amon Sûl podcast theme music is Hidden Past, and the closing theme is Celtic Impulse, both by Kevin MacLeod, whose music you can find at incompetech.com.
Our podcast cover art was created by Samuel Hebel, our audio producer is Charlotte Martin, and our video editor is Simon Nelson.
And special thanks go to the Amon Sûl Facebook group for conversation and inspiration, even though it's been kind of quiet over there, so we need to stir up some hornets and see what we can do. I'm your host, Father Anthony Cook, and even though after this episode, Father Andrew will have to create a new podcast called Mushrooms, Farmers, Guard Dogs, and the Fungus That Fuels Them. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.